Good day, my fellow Americans and good people of the world. Today I would like to address you in regards to a few things that have been mulling over in my mind today. We are in a really, difficult place in our nation right now, and as people are starting to rev up in preparation for the midterms, I'm already seeing the groundwork being laid for the parties to distinguish themselves as being the opposition and to distinguish their form of governance, their methods, and their approaches to be distinct in such a way that it's compelling or appealing to certain groups of the population. And I understand that's how the parties have done it for a very long time. That has never been appealing to me. I have many aspects of the Democratic Party that I align with, and there's many aspects of the Republican Party that I align with in terms of valued principles. It's unfortunate that I can't really say that in terms of the current expression of those two parties, because they really fall short of, the ideological framework by which people think Democrat, Republican, it's not even the same beast anymore. They have changed, and something that I listened to this person in conversation on one of my favorite news media platforms, MS Now. One of their guests put it pretty plainly that the Democratic Party has, since the dawning of the Donald stepping on the political scene, they have been this force of opposing him and trying to say we're not him, and to cast him in this light that he's so bad and at least we're not him, and they really lost sight of the principalities of policy standards that are in such a way that people can expect that when they consider what is the Democratic Party, that this is what they stand for, because they have had to turn so much in opposition to Trump, and that was his superpower, was to be able to make everything about him, and then he steps on the scene with this MAGA brand that he had been mulling over, and really figured, because he's good at branding, a way to infuse an idea into the fewest words possible, and it be such a loosey general thing that many things can be caught under that umbrella term. And over the years, it's just, it's evolved and it's mutated and it's morphed and it's come to represent, when you look at it from an outsider's perspective, kind of like a catch-all from the worst tendencies of Americans. And it has become this safe haven for people who really were looking for somewhere where they could be their worst tendencies embraced, and championed for, and welcomed, and invited in with a sense of belonging. And a lot of that, I think, was contrasted because the Democratic Party was so, high on the horse, high and mighty, that many people were repulsed by that sense of this sense of unforgiveness, when somebody makes a mistake, or a sense that like you can't belong with our group because we have to adhere to this really high standard. And then you know, there's some people, like even like right-wing spokespeople now, that I remember, like what's her name, Megyn Kelly, from the pre-Trump era, and she really did not come across in this really like amplified sense of the equivalency of FU power. Like, I'm just gonna say whatever I want and nobody can, stop me. And if they do, then thanks for the, cannon fodder I can throw back at you. And, there was this sense of like respectableness that she had embodied. And then she seemed to just kind of give that all away for this like mantle of being looked to by the MAGA, powers and the MAGA cohort as being this like voice that speaks for them and speaks to them and, says all the things that they want to hear, that gives them rubbed up in their feelings and their emotions. It's like, aha, yeah, you get me. And it's a rhetorical art, and she's very good at it. But, the thing about it was just like, where was the point in time, I wonder, in her life where she made that switch of allowing herself to no longer adhere with a sense of like ethical guidelines and moral legitimacies and journalistic integrities, to the point where it really broke my heart when she spoke to her audience to try to lend apologies for people who aligned with Epstein's actions towards underage girls in sexual exploitation. And that she lent this sense of like there's some sort of excuse that, like a pass, a free pass that can be given to people who, seek young girls, that as if the age of it being okay for older men to seek after girls is like, if they're 14, 15, that's okay. And the real problem I had with that was, as I watched her speak those words, I really like looked at her in her wholeness, and I really think she believes that. And regardless of whether somehow in her head she justifies that and that she's okay with her children making those choices at that age, with older men, seeking them out, knowing that they are of that younger age, whatever she reconciles in her head as a justification, the real like frustrating part of it was that in the context of talking about these young girls who have identified themselves as being made victim of this diabolical plot, a scheme, a whole entire conspiracy to corner girls into a situation where they can be exploited for, their ignorance or their tough situation, or, compelled of like, this is the way that you have to do things if you're going to belong in this world, and this is the ins that you get to get into this industry, or like, here's the capacity to financially support your family, or like all of these like ways that these older men with money, power, privilege, access, operating off a sense of immunity because they're all insularly protecting one another, chose to approach young women and seek from them something that they wanted to gain from them that was, on its face morally reprehensible. And for her to cast that these young girls were making a conscious decision of what they were doing based off of like they were asking for it, and that really just strips them of their humanity and kind of puts them in a place of like all that they're good for, all that they're capable of in their life was that result of being exploited by these older, powerful men, and then forced into a situation where they weren't allowed to speak out about that, to the point where they're even having a hard time right now speaking out about it because it's intimidation and threats of harm, and these are big powerful people that who knows what they are going to do in order to protect their reputation. And for her to sit there and try to give a pass for people that used their powerful positions in roles in society to exploit these young women, and to give it a pass like they knew what they were doing, and then not even like, let's just look at the psychological aspects of things. I mean, a youth's mind isn't even fully developed until the age of 25, scientifically proven, and so to think that, at such a young age, that they would have the mature sensibilities about them to really know the consequences of their actions, and we should be living in a society that doesn't create the situational context where, a child would have to make the decision of whether or not that's right or that's wrong, because these sorts of things just shouldn't be happening to them at this age. And if we took more seriously the need, the societal need as being a sexualized species as we are, for proper sex education that is a part of the human development process all the way through childhood development process, so that children understand their bodies and understand what no means, and understand that their body is their possession and not somebody else's. And they understand, not in a moral, you're gonna burn in hell type sense, no promiscuity, like these sorts of things. No, just like, this is your body, this is your life, this is your decision. And, engaging in sexual acts is an intimate part of the human experience, and it should be approached with a clear mind and a clear conscience. And never should it be a point in time where somebody is intimidating you or coercing you or forcing you into making decisions you otherwise would not make if you were making those decisions based off of your own sensibilities of what's best for you. And so it really bothered me that she seemed to just take away that personal body autonomy right of personal self-dominion to make choices for yourself away from these girls, and to place it as something that it's perfectly fine for these adult men in powerful positions to use whatever means necessary to manipulate the situation by which to extract the choice and the decision from these young girls, by whatever means that they used. Regardless, it's inappropriate, because it's exploiting and abusing a power dynamic of also the sense of like, well, this person's an adult and it's mature, and maybe they know more than I do, and so you're leading these young girls astray from what would have been a life choice that they could have made that would have been a really beautiful part of their full integrated human experience. And instead of that being, their choice to engage in that in such a way where it's, a beautiful human developmental experience, it was taken in a violating way. Their personhood was violated by these exploitive men and women. They were taken advantage of, they were exploited, they were harmed. And I don't think that it's right for any person to try to, beat around, what's the area in which when it's right or it's wrong, ultimately the decision rests with the individual. And it's incumbent upon us as a society to make sure they're well educated about their own bodies and their own personal development and this beautiful experience of human sexuality, but never for that to be put in a position of exploitation and harm. It is a beautiful part of the human explorative process of growth, and it had been tainted by these abusers, and it took away a part of their humanity that they will never be able to get back. It skewed their life perspective and their life experiences. It took away and stole their innocence. And I don't think any person should be giving a justification for that, or giving a free pass to these men who should have known better and did know better because they're well aware of the law. Our law states that you have to be at least over the age of 18 to make those types of decisions for yourself, And even at that, like I was saying, developmentally, you don't really have a full grasp of your humanness until you're 25. Your brain isn't even fully, developed into that point in time. It's not saying that you have to hold off until that point in time, but society as a whole, we mutually have decided that 18 is the age of consent. And that anybody below that age doesn't really have the capacity to give consent. Regardless of whether the person says yes, it's not legitimately consent. By our social, moral, ethical standards and legal standards in society. And so justifying this by any means of the age it's fine, 14, 15, no. If you want that to change, that distinction that we've made together as a collective, and we've decided this is our social and civic ideal that we are going to abide by, then change the law. But until the law is changed, that's where it stands. And the fact of the matter is that these people who exploited these young girls knew where the law stood, and they defied it intentionally, willfully, knowingly. And knowing that they were in the wrong, they went above and beyond and out of their way in order to hide what they were doing, because it was wrong and it was illegal. And so the problem isn't looking at the girls and trying to say, well, there's some sort of justification that, they asked for it. No. The part of the morality completely falls on those people who knew they were breaking the law. They knew they were doing the wrong thing. It may have felt right to them for whatever, sick pleasures they derived out of it, but it was wrong. And that's why you're seeing so many people trying so very hard to cover up this whole entire Epstein debacle, right? How many people that, have been outed so far, just even in their involvements with him, have been, put in this light of so that's the type of standard that you hold for yourself and others, and that's the type of world that you want us to live in, is where it's okay if you do that, but yet you expect a legal moral standard for other people that they should be in trouble, through the legal, process if they do these sorts of things. It's like, laws for thee but not for me. When you have that sort of tiered breakdown of the legal system, it becomes just inherently unjust, unfair, unreasonable, unright, completely wrong, rather. And then you have the issues of like these people who have money, power, and influence wield that in such a way to get themselves out of trouble. They do like, settlement agreements in order to not drag victims through the court system. They just do settle agreements, and they're given money, and maybe that does something to like prevent them from being further harmed through the legal process of going through court, but it will never make them whole. It will never restore them to wholeness, because they're living still regardless of what they've been given, with the knowing that these people that did something wrong will never be held account to that, and that's not justice, And then how frustrating it must be for them to learn that they're not the only ones that were victim. And it's an amazing, powerful thing to see all these survivors of Epstein that have come together into a sisterhood, to stand with each other and say, like, what happened is not your fault. And that, had you had, a situation in which there were people that cared about protecting your personhood and protecting your innocence, and looking out for you, that these sorts of things wouldn't have happened. And if you could have gone to, some sort of authority and called it out, and for there to be actual consequences that would have put it into this, that wasn't in turn putting you in a more dangerous situation, you would have come out sooner. And so it's a really challenging social dilemma we're in right now, but we're all living it out loud, aren't we? Out in the open, and we're having these really difficult conversations, and we are drawing the lines of demarcation in our society to say, like, this is what we consider to be right and wrong, and this is a very important conversation, but then you have people like POTUS trying to say we just need to move on from this. Are you kidding me? Nothing has been resolved. Some papers have come to light, not even in their full context, and so it's naturally distorted, the information that's there, because we don't know everything, that's going on there. Like, the releasing of some files is not enough to restore wholeness to these victims. It's not enough to restore the perpetrators to wholeness too, so that they don't go on continuing to think that they can live in this, impunity circumstance of like, well, there's not enough to get me in trouble, but, it's enough that I can, if we just move on, the PR will eventually, be out of the news cycle, and everything will be fine for them, and sure, there are a few high profile people that are being held to an account of some sorts, or they're losing their status or their standing or their positions or their authorities and these sorts of things, and these are good in the sense of like, those institutions that are backing up those people that made the decision that those people need to go is an institutional standard that's setting this, negatively sanctioning these people, saying like, we don't want to associate with somebody who makes those decisions, And I think that's a really important way for us to help with the healing process of this, because it's not just the victims that need to be healed, and it's not just the perpetrators that need to be healed, it's society as a whole, obviously. Otherwise, these sorts of things wouldn't be happening. And let's get it very straight that just because Epstein is the big profile sex trafficker, there's still plenty of other traffickers that are out there. And right now, the POTUS 47's administration is directing resources away from being able to go after those type of people. So those sorts of things are being left unchecked, uninvestigated, and many more victims are being made as we speak. And there's nobody there to help to stop it. And that's a horrible human tragedy. But that's just a sign of the priorities of this administration. They don't care. They do not care about you. They do not care about protecting innocence. It's not even the first thing on their mind. The first thing on their mind is, let's move on from everybody talking about, how administration after administration, dropped the ball and left and right to, allow for this thing to go on and many, many more victims be made because nobody stood up for these young ladies, when they first came out and protected their innocence. And so society, we're all having this very long conversation about it now, aren't we? And there's lots of emotions. There's anger, and there's frustration, and there's disappointment, and there's sadness. And there's a kind of happiness for the victims who are finally starting to see some light at the end of the tunnel, of this dark tunnel that they've been walking through for so long. Just trying to be taken seriously, trying to get a standing in society where people will actually look to them as not being victims of this terrible circumstance, but rather strong women that are committed to justice and want to see, that justice prevail. They want to be done right by their government. They want their government to serve them well. And to also, for their government not to be protecting these elite interests. Because that's what made this whole mess possible to begin with, was this creation of this world by which these, little insulated pockets of elite thriving are able to operate outside of the law, outside of, responsibilities of adhering to social and civic ideals. And many of them, can't be held accountable for reasons ranging from, nobody's gonna hold them to account. They're too big to fail. They have more than enough money to throw at the problem. Their lawyers will go after them, or they have a whole band of, loyal followers that will go off and attack somebody or threaten them, and it becomes this just very dangerous situation, and it's terrible. It's terrible that world exists, and that society can see that now. It's plain as day with the whole Epstein thing being, revelations being brought to light. And yet, instead of concentrating and focusing on creating laws that can help to break up that type of power stronghold that allows for these people to get away with doing bad things to good people, to violate innocence, do violence against somebody's personhood in such a way, break up the capacity for that power to happen and reinforce institutions that help to, weed out the, unlikely circumstance where, these sorts of things are going to go left unchecked for long periods of time. Our society shouldn't have had such a long history of the Epstein saga, and years of questions and uncertainties and attempted reporting, and people just trying to, victims trying to seek justice and to restore wholeness, to help with the healing process, to be taken seriously. Years of these sorts of things, and nothing was done. So we clearly need institutional supports by which there's a whole process that isn't based off of, who's in power making the decisions, and they can be so swayed to not act on the information that they have. rather automatic default corrective mechanizations within our law standards and the means by which it's executed within the justice system that is beyond the control of an individual to be able to stop it once it's started. And it becomes an automatic, autonomous thing that runs through the entire motions of distinguishing, at the scale that is necessary, like following through on leads to say, is there legitimacy to this? And then process it through to the full extent that the law can provide, a resolve to it, and grant restitution where needed. Allow for redemption and forgiveness. Corrective mechanisms should be installed in our society as such that these sorts of things can't go left unchecked because, whoever happens to be the person in the decision-making role decides to act or to not act on something. Think of how much effort it took to get all of Congress to finally say, okay, we're coming together on this. We're going to say, let's release the files. But even at that, there was no teeth in that law because the POTUS 47's administration intentionally broke that law for a very long time. Well over a month, and people are still scratching their heads. Why do we only have 30,000 documents? And then they do this whole total dump of 3 million after they said that there was 6, and so we're being held out of half for some arbitrary, we have some excuse here, there, or other as to why we're not releasing it, with a bunch of redactions that don't make sense and that throw things out of context and make it impossible for anybody to really truly know what's going on. The whole thing, it was like making a mess in order to make it impossible for there ever to be a corrective mechanism set up as a consequence of the release of these papers. These papers, these documents, these files were not just about, here, let it all be out in the open and let's talk about it for a little while and then let's all move on. It's supposed to give us a legitimate means to understand the depths by which this entire debacle was perpetrated, who was involved and how and why, and to really, test the character of the people who chose to involve themselves in that world. And to really understand, how did we become such a society where people were, so gung-ho to involve themselves with somebody who, by whatever, standards of success they might have been attracted to him or connected to him, where was their moral compass to say, it doesn't matter how much money this person has, how much power this person has, how much influence this person has, how many friends and connections they have, there should be a moral standard within people, especially these grown adults, should know better and should say, I'm going to be an integrity-bound person and not involve myself with those type of people because I can see what they're doing is wrong. And I don't want to in any way help support their capacity to do that wrong in society. And that's where we really have the greatest moral dilemma, right? Is the fact that so many rich and powerful people enabled Epstein to do these really bad, terrible, god-awful things. And to get away with it. And I think we should be sanctioning society, socially sanctioning them to the point where it's no, if you thought that was okay, then we're not okay with anything else that you think is okay, because what other low moral bar standards have you set for your decision making? Has the success that you've gotten in your life gone through nefarious means to achieve it as well? There were people that were talking about Epstein being some kind of master manipulator and blackmailer or whatever, and then that's how he enriched himself and he entangled all these people, and how is that any different than what many people in these this deviant echelon of society, the people who deviate for what is social and civic ideals of a free, fair, and morally legitimate society? It brings us to question. It's like, if they make morally dubious decisions, based off of their alignments in whatever capacity, with Epstein being, publicly, consciously aware of what was going on and not intentionally calling out and saying, I'm taking extreme ownership of my decisions. I understand that I made an error, I made a mistake. It wasn't something that was based off of that's who I am, but it was where I was at the time. And, had I been thinking clearly, I wouldn't have aligned with that. And given everything I know now, in hindsight, I apologize deeply for the people that I've hurt and that I've harmed, because it is not a sensibility that I want to have, morally integrity bound in my soul per alignment, that it's okay for me to involve myself with such subhuman type people that would be so evil. Something. Take extreme ownership of the situation, and really base it off of your own decision making, in the aftermath. It's not everybody else's fault. You did that. Take ownership for it. And for society to see people stepping up and doing that, guess what? It will become more acceptable that these people were people who made really, really bad mistakes. And yes, they did harm individuals. And our hope is that in us knowing that and them taking ownership for it, that we can work out such a way where we can have a new type of respect for them, of understanding, like, you were willing to take responsibility for this in such a way that you want to set things right. I would love to see the people who, in any capacity, in any form, had some type of situational context and an alignment with Epstein, to step up and take extreme ownership and say, instead of just saying my bad, or I didn't really do that, or wasn't so bad, or I'm ashamed of myself, whatever, like, how about instead you help us as a society to invest in those corrective mechanisms that prevent these sorts of situations from even being able to happen ever again. That would be moral courage. It would be a conscious decision to set things right. And to find your way back into love with society, and for society to have love for you, and not love in a romantic, intimate sense, but just like love for your fellow human being. Like, we all do make mistakes. The point in this isn't to punish. At least from my perspective, I don't want it to be about punishment. I wouldn't want it to be that way. Because that then it may be conscious, but more likely not conscious, but it will put a moral dilemma on the victims to have to live with as well. So it's burdening them with more that's going to weigh them down karmatically, instead of liberating everybody from this terrible, terrible truth that we all are living through right now. We need to create corrective mechanisms. We need to allow for the opportunity for social sanctioning. We need to invite people to, take extreme ownership of their mistakes, ask for forgiveness, and work towards, a sensibility of, like, I'm restoring justice. I may not have done anything enough to get me in trouble through the court system, criminal or civil, but you can still say this was wrong, fundamentally wrong, and my involvement helped to create the capacity for other people's involvement, and even the people who were in the worst involvement. And so you got to take ownership of that and say, like, I'm not okay with these outcomes that we're living in because of a poor decision that I made in the past. And I want to do right by the survivors. I want to do right by America and our standard of society and what we consider as our social and civic ideals. And I want to do right by the future to make sure that innocence will be protected in the future. These sorts of things should not be allowed to spring up and manifest and take hold in society ever again. So I'm willing to do the good work to help to invest in, especially a lot of these people are very rich and powerful people who have platforms, are able to make moves in society, invest in the development of society for us to be able to have something tangible to use as a means to move on from this in a way that's healing and restorative and is, anti-corruption, and it's a corrective mechanism, and in such a way where we don't have to vilify even the worst people who did the worst things, where in a case we could come through conscious effort and intentional, like, this is what we're going to work on towards as a restorative justice outcome that is in the best interest of everybody, to the point where, maybe we could look at Maxwell, who ended up getting, prison sentence for her involvement with Epstein, that where she may be able to be in the receiving end of a corrective mechanism of restoration, reintegration, and personal development, and hopefully one day potentially forgiveness too, for herself and then from others. That is a very, very, very lofty, appeal, and it may be a price that which some survivors who have had to experience the most damage are just never going to be able to personally reconcile and be okay with, But I do believe there is a way for us to mediate, the process that they will have to go through in order to come to terms with it, through this conscious awareness of, like, the person who did wrong to you is doing what is right and necessary to set things right. They're doing the hard and necessary work of personal development and taking extreme ownership. They're paying their debt to society in the sense that they created this circumstance in which this is a thing that we now have, it's a situation we now have to deal with, and they're doing what they can to help to restore it so that it now becomes this thing that we've resolved together as a collective society, that this is how we are going to put the period at the end of the sentence of, this is what happened, and let it be done from there, in a sense of, like, now we're moving on beyond that point, all of us, through the growth of the experience of working this problem together, to come out on the other side where, like, not everybody's going to be totally satisfied with the outcome, but we can all agree to work towards that sensibility of consensus building. It's like, yeah, you know what, we really do want to do the good, hard, and necessary work to, restore the integrities of our nation so that we can move on from this, as better people, because of the experience of growth that we internalized and went through together to solve this problem together, and to find the ways through, our social paradigm, our ontology, our way of life, our roots and our culture, to help to give that healing balm to, the survivors who are going to have the hardest time struggling with the reconciliation of that. Not saying everybody's going to go through it, but I can imagine being so sympathetic and putting myself in their shoes, like it's going to be a very, very hard time for them to heal, but this is a way to get them there. And society can do the good work to provide a healing balm to them that can help to ease the pain, to help them to be restored to wholeness, so they can live with it without the emotional, strain or the pain and the suffering and the anguish, to get them to a point where they can live in peace with it. And I just think as a society, it's not asking much for us to get to the point where we can have that type of resolution, have that type of outcome, and work on it together, engineer it together so we can follow through with it. So we don't have to take this like negative, punitive, angry approach to it, but like really just a realistic, we just want to set things right. We never want this to happen again. We want to have good outcomes for everybody involved and create a circumstance where goodwill can proceed in our society. Because right now, the way that we're approaching this, in the us versus them, and like, protecting the predators, trying to protect the victims, like, it's keeping us apart and preventing us from being able to find that through line of consensus, the things we can agree on. Like, this is just fair, reasonable, and right. And let's argue those finer points through dialogue and discourse and debate on a public stage, yes, but not in such a way where, it's trying to give justifications of doing violence against children. As if children can make that decision for themselves. They're asking for it, and it's perfectly fine because, of a certain age. No, society as a whole, we've decided, 18 is the level of maturity by which you must ascend to through age to be able to give consent. And that shouldn't even be a debatable question. Let's at least adhere by that standard. It's the law, for Christ's sakes. And if you don't think that law is, right, we'll appeal to your fellow Americans to amend that sensible law, And those are the sorts of approaches that I really wish we could take in regards to this particular, social dilemma. It's a social, culture, political, even economic dilemma, right? Especially because look, like, what happens when society does not have the appropriate, like, we gotta keep within reasonable controls, the capacity for people to grow in wealth to the point where nobody can ever be, immune from, to operate with impunity, to never be able to be held responsible for their actions or their breaking the law, So we need to be able to have a way to temper our economic paradigm so that people don't have the capacity to, get away with anything, And I think it's reasonable for us to, like, really start having that conscious conversation of, like, what's the America that we want to live in, I'm so tired. So tired of having the conversation of, like, I don't want America to do that. I'm not okay with these outcomes. Like, I'm so tired of having to have this conversation all the time. But I understand we have to because, like, we're not all sitting down at the same table and negotiating and hashing out this, experience, the American experience together, and defining and delineating it in such a way where we're like, oh, okay, we're all on the same page. Let's go out and live our lives. We don't really have the platform capacity to do that, which comes into this is why I really want, and I think it's crucial to have an innovative approach to our federal government that helps us to stay a united States of America, a true platform by which every American can come to the table and have a discussion, their voice can be heard, and heard on the merits, and for us to dialogue and discuss and determine those things which we believe is in our collective best interest, and really help to guide and inform the type of policies we need to make in order for us to be able to create that more perfect union. Like, oh, we have laws that are binding us in this way. Well, that doesn't really work out for the best interests of all parties involved. These relevant stakeholders at the table are bringing their voice in. They're saying, man, this doesn't really work how it's designed. There aren't corrective mechanisms, or, it only applies to certain people. If you're rich, it doesn't apply, How do we solve for those sorts of things? Everybody at the table giving your inputs, and then we use that to inform the decisions of like how we're going to restructure, reorient, readjust our models of governance so that we can all live in a cohesive unit. Like, we're all obliged to the social and civic ideals that we have confirmed and conformed together and informed each other of, and we have pledged ourselves to abide by these social and civic ideals. And then we do the work necessary through education and innovation and infrastructure and social experiential opportunities within our lifescapes, our living environments, and our home spaces for people to embed these principles and live them and be them and do them and reflect back on them and struggle with them, so that you can achieve growth in such a way where like you're teaching ourselves and others is like, this is not necessarily easy for everybody or easy all the time, and yes, sometimes it is a challenge and we do have to put in effort to do it, but man, what we get as an outcome consequence, as we're engineering those outcomes together through our experience, we are making an amazing place of this place we call home. America will be so much better for those things which we abide by in law and rules and norms, and principles, and those things that we adhere to that are in that mutualisms, mutual respect, mutual interests, mutual securities, mutual benefits, and to conform ourselves to that in a reasonable sense. And if for some reason it's not really working out anymore, because things change, people change, dynamics change, that's why we're called a republic. We elect officials that help us to republic our representatives so that it better reflects who the people are as of now. As demographics change, populations change, people's interests change, cultures change. Like, when new technology comes in, we change, and so we get new representatives in there. We elect them as we republic, we reconstitute our elected officials so they better reflect the people of who they are, and they can help us to direct the conversations and the dialogues and get people to the situation room and sit there and talk with one another and have that conversation and get at that negotiating table and work on it together. And so we need an innovative, publicly accessible, easy to use platform by which all of this stuff can be, brought to the fore and like really hashed out, and tested, against that foil, and understand, like, is this truth? And to assert what truth is, and to have a shared and common sensibility of what is truth and reality, and to bring in questions of like doubts and concerns and be skeptical. These are important things. Ask questions. We want to know the answers, and bring what you believe is the best truth that you know, but be open to the possibilities you may be wrong, and be willing to listen to others who maybe have a little bit more experience or understanding or expertise, but don't shut out the people who may have new and innovative ideas of like insights of like, have you ever considered taking a perspective in this way? Consider it from this context or this ideal. Through my lived experience, the results were a little bit different. have a place for us to come together and share those insights with one another so we can resolve out problems together. I mean, imagine having that type of, like, constitutionally, legitimized, publicly accessible, technologically advanced, new age innovation in terms of, like, it's really about getting people's, public presence to have a place of belonging, a seat at the actual table that we built, of conversation. And for what happens in that dialogue, that space actually transfers into legitimate language of laws that we create, because we recognize these are the laws that we need. And this is like how we can actually execute those laws. We can abide by those laws. We can live in accordance to those laws. It's most natural and it's most reasonable. And it's, shared, yeah, that would be right, just, fair, reasonable, right. And that we have a way to execute it, but also to, make sure if the law is being broken, there's corrective mechanisms for it too. And having a platform for us to all have those conversations, we would be able to have a more civil society. And expecting us to have that type of technological platform, we have the feasible capacity to do that now. And what that would empower us to be is a more direct democracy. Imagine what Americans would think and feel about being American if they knew their voice mattered and it counted, in ways like, take the way somebody feels their vote counts and then think that, amplify that because they know their voice counts. Their voice on this topic of interest, care, concern matters, and it makes a difference in a tangible way. And they are a part of the process, their participation, their contribution makes a difference, and they can see it, and they live it, and they experience it, and they can internalize it, and they can be more okay with the outcomes, because at least they were able to say their piece. Even if it wasn't everything that they wanted, we're working together towards building consensus, and this is a legitimate thing. Now imagine that beautiful, brilliant platform, that everybody in society can belong to and involve with. Imagine having something like that for us to work out this difficult, challenging, perplexing, difficult issue of solving for a outcome, a ultimate outcome to dealing with this Epstein debacle, especially because, Epstein's not around anymore. We can't just send him to jail and say, oh, see, justice served. Like, there's a lot of restorative stuff we're going to have to do, a lot of corrective measures we're going to have to do, a lot of people are going to have to be held accountable and take responsibility, Some people willingly, and that's what we're gearing towards, we're hoping for, right? At least that's my ideal for it, but there are going to be some people that are going to be hesitant or resistant to it, and they have to be compelled, to do that, because it really is in their best interest, because it is in the collective best interest, and we have standards that we're raising and expecting everybody to get to in society. And I think it would be a way for us to have a more cohesive, coherent public dialogue about problems when we need to resolve them. And so you get a lot less of the, pointing fingers and making, like, irrational demands of other people, or, this situation where it's like, I'm very much in this very difficult situation with, there's somebody that's very important to me in my life that I have to intentionally, keep myself separate from, because of the fact that they can't take a stance of what is happening with Epstein debacle and just call it out and say it's wrong, you know? And that's a difficult situation for me to be in, especially because I'm like, I don't want to make anybody do anything that they don't want to do from a personal situation, especially when it's somebody I care about deeply. But at the same time, it's like, I have such a strong sensibility about there needing to be justice, what's just, fair, reasonable, and right. And in my worldview, the just, fair, reasonable, and right thing to do in this context is to call this out as being wrong and to, make a demand of social sanctioning of people and to, make a conscious personal choice to diverge from relationships with people who would have alignments with the Epstein world, who are choosing to defend their past and prior decision making rather than taking ownership for it, And that's a difficult place for me to be in as a person. I can imagine other individuals who are more deeply entangled with other people that are involved in the, fallout from the revelations of the Epstein files release, in so much as we've had, release, companies and family members and friends and, business partners and people that you're deeply entangled with financially or reputationally, or these are people that were your life partners or they're your parents. Like, oh my God, right? How exceedingly difficult it must be for people like that to reconcile all of this. There's so many people that are impacted by this. They're affected. Nobody's walking away from this unscathed. Nobody. And his impact was global. I mean, we have people in it's not just concentrated in America, all over the world there are people who are deeply impacted by this. And by degrees of, separation from one person having to do with him, man, you spread out from there and you have degrees of separation, and those people know other people, and somehow everybody is connected to it. And even just the thought of it makes me feel gross. It's like, we're all complicit. And that's why it's important we all take responsibility in some way. We take ownership in some way. And what I've been able to find myself to be able to do is to share enthusiastic support of the survivors in their pursuit of the truth being brought to light, and for their, collaboration with one another to heal together in a sisterhood, and to intentionally support other, victims of abuse to help them to turn into survivors who are healers and fighters and supporters to prevent these sorts of things from happening in society. Voicing my opinions on these things, calling out the injustices, showing my distaste and dissatisfaction for those who involved in it, and to call them out on their bullshit. It's like, really, after everything that's being revealed about your life decisions to involve yourself with this man, all that you can amount to say is like, I'm not the worst of them. Well, at least I didn't do what this other person did. It's like, come on, man. Ownership, the buck stops with you and your decision making. And you have the ultimate choice to say, I made a mistake. And this is what I'm willing to do to set things right. And so I really advocate for that. And I desperately want, because I believe in the redemption of everybody, and I don't want this to be this terrible dark cloud that lingers over us and we're never able to heal from it. I want to get to the point where we can all just be okay and forgive. It doesn't mean what happened is okay, because it will never be okay, but that we are okay. We are okay as individuals, We're okay as survivors. We are okay as perpetrators, you know, the people who made mistakes. We're okay as society and all the people who dropped the ball that should have done the right thing to prevent this from getting worse. You know, we are all okay. And we're not okay because we're just moving on. And we're not okay because we're ignoring the situation. We're denying it. We're just saying that's the way that life is now. Adjusting our standards to demoralization. No. We uplift ourselves to a higher standard. And we build and innovate the means by which we can have the corrective mechanisms so this will never happen again. And we use that as the integrity-bound stance that we can collectively take to say this is what we will not stand for ever again. And this is what we're going to do if it ever tries to manifest again. And we will never let it get this way and get that bad ever again. You know what? And if people make that choice after we collectively choose that we're going to do the right thing and heal and we're going to forgive and move on, you know, then the sanctioning in that aftermath, in that new world paradigm of like, no, we said we weren't ever going to do this again. The sanctioning will be much worse, and the consequences must be much harsher, and the law must have a corrective mechanism that is more exact and more precise and more, again, I don't like punish and punitive, but more corrective in the strongest of terms, so that you're not going to wiggle out of the situation and just get away with it and move on. You know, there are consequences to your actions. You know, it's like if we are really building up and working towards a clean slate, which I really believe is in the best interest of everybody to do that, you know, again, but we have to build it, we have to work towards it, we have to mutually agree and involve ourselves with that, we have to have the conversations, we have to intentionally heal from this. Once we get to that point where we can say, okay, you know, clean slate. I mean, it's kind of like a whiteboard that had the imprints of writing on it for a very, very, very long time. And then you clean it away, there's still like a deeply embedded residue that's still, you can kind of make it out there, it's there. So it's not a completely clean slate, right? You know, we're not forgetting this, but we are forgiving so that we can move on. So, you know, we can put new ideas and new concepts on our whiteboards. We can concern ourselves with other things, because the reality is there's so many other things that we really have to focus on, you know, and we can't, you know, forget this and just go on, you know, dealing with other stuff. If we don't resolve this, we are never going to have the necessary, rational, shared self-interest of foundational trust to be able to work together on anything else. You know, this is our chance to create a clean slate by which we can all come together, you know, on the same terms and conditions, you know. And I really hope for that. I really hope for that in the best sense. And like, I appeal to your humanity on that level to say, like, I know it won't be easy. It is the hard work, but it is the necessary work. And if we choose to do it together, it could have the best possible outcomes for all parties involved. It will help us to establish better relationships and friendships and more goodwill. We will be able to live in a coherent sense of base reality truth with one another, you know, which is like gold. And we will be able to, from there, be able to have a sensibility of what is just, fair, reasonable, and right for all parties involved. In this context, if we can build that, we can build that in any context, you know. And I really believe that this has that capacity, because I see how it so deeply impacts the sensibilities of people in the MAGA cohort. You know, I love, respect, and appreciate all people. I do not like the MAGA cohort. And it's not the individual. I'm not pointing to a certain specific person and say, I hate you, because I don't hate anybody. I love everybody. but the magnified sensibilities that people, it's like this host, this like, you know, crazy like alien thing that is like attached itself to people and is like doing the thinking for them, and they're not able to rationalize, you know, as a fellow human being, as a fellow American, because this thing is like running the show for them in terms of like their perspectives, their perceptions, their outlooks, you know, what they're willing to take on as, you know, a proposition in society. If it doesn't align with this magnified ideal, like they wholly reject it, you know. And it's really creepy, and it's very sad, and so I don't like MAGA, you know. And the people who are really deeply entrenched in it, and even worse, the ones that know better and involve themselves with it because it's an opportunity to exploit the naivety of the people who have been embedded in this world, you know, that's really a hard one to reconcile. It's like, because you are a bad actor with nefarious intent who are exploiting the weaknesses that you perceive in other people who have been, you know, put in this, you know, vulnerable situation because they're misplacing trust in this MAGA ideal that, you know, even on the surface, man, doesn't really have much appeal in terms of like, what does it do for you in improving your life? I mean, other than it brings out the worst in you and it gives you a sense that, you know, I can be an asshole and get away with it. Like, is that really a worthy life? Not really. It doesn't really make you a lot of friends. Sure, friends in the MAGA cohort, but it's like, you know, when somebody thinks it's okay to, you know, take away the humanity of others, or to do injustice to others, or do violence to others, you know, because they're an other, it is not far from you to be pivoted in some degree in the outcast of the in group, and then suddenly you're made the target. So I don't like to, that's why I don't really like political parties, man, because they do that. But MAGA is a different beast in its own. It's its own extreme, and it's such a weird, mutated, you know, version of it. It's very cult-like, and, you know, it just brings out the worst in everybody, you know. And Trump is at the pinnacle of that, you know. And I really feel sorry for him. I feel pity and disappointment for him. I don't feel sorry for him. I feel pity and disappointment for him, you know, because he's a capable person that had so much to offer the world, and he chose to be an abuser and an exploiter, you know. And that's how he's governing the nation, and it really isn't working out for the best interest of everybody. You know, other nations hate us when they used to love us. You know, we're looked upon as being the mistake of the world now. You know, people laughed at us, and they feel sorry for us, and they feel pity and disappointment for us too, because Trump is reflecting this sense of, you know, his erratic, nonsensical, incoherent babble that he speaks on the world stage on America's behalf translates that America dumb, you know, and that does terrible for the people that visit, you know, overseas, and then we have to explain ourselves. Like, listen, I know your impression is based off of our president because they're, you know, effectively, you know, are, you know, the face of the company, and they're doing a lot of reputational damage right now, but we're better than this. Not everybody's in alignment with that, you know, and the fact that we have to put so much effort in excusing away our president's, you know, terribleness is a horrible place for America to be in, you know. And the fact that he's picking fights with everybody, and he's bullying people, and he's extorting people, and he's manipulating people and exploiting people, and it's like, that's who he is. I get it, that's how he's made his way in the world. That's how he's become who he is, and, and he's gotten away with it because society has never put a check or balance on him, because he's a part of that elite deviant echelon that never has consequences for their actions. So they never think of personal self-development to do better and be better. And he's never been in a situation where he had to be consciously responsible for other people. He passed off, the responsibilities of parenting off to the mothers. Like, that's their job, So, even his own children, he never, had to, go through the whole process of raising a child and help them to go through the developmental process, He's never had to actually care for anybody, but himself and his self-serving interests. And that's who is now in charge of the care of our country. He is the caretaker of all of America's assets and property and collective interests. And he's the caregiver for every life that is, in a position of, outcome from a decision from POTUS. Because that's not just involving everybody who's in America, him being the caregiver over all of our lives, but also the lives of, our allies, foreign nations that he looks at as if, that's a nice piece of property I sure would like to have, or, you got the assets that I need, and it's not just those nations that have their resources, but it's the people, who are now put in this very, very terrible situation of, from a distance, somebody, now being the one who has the control over their lives. And the problem with, Trump being a caregiver over people all over the world based off of his position of being able to make decisions, utilizing all the powers of American, capacities. The problem is that Trump doesn't have the capacity to care. And so there's a tremendous amount of misplaced trust there, right? But I have hope in the MAGA cohort that have just really fawned over Trump being this just incredible person, and have ignored his faults and his failings and everything, supported him and all in for, getting him to be president, and, he can do no wrong and all these things. I'm starting to see some light and sensibilities of their, rationalization of the world. It's wait a second, I'm looking at my life and it's actually kind of getting worse, man. And the world's becoming a way more scary place than it was before. And, I don't really think it's working out for America's interests when you're making these doings and dealings with other countries, and even in those scenarios, you look at the outcomes, and America's not the first in consideration. It's Trump and his family, and what they get out of the deal. And then America just kind of if America even benefits in any way. In some cases, I don't really think America does. We're put at a disadvantage. And so people are waking up to that. But, it was something that, somebody said that I heard in an interview on, my favorite news media channel, MS Now, and they said that, I believe it was Lawrence that said it. He was just it's the one thing that is, separating MAGA from their allegiance and fidelity and loyalties to Trump is the whole Epstein debacle. And so I see that there's hope in that, and that's why I think it could be the one thing that we use as our restorative process, this problem we work on together to solve. And in that process, we can heal from the rifts that have been created by this MAGification and Trumpism of society. Pull people away from that. Trump's not going to be here much longer. He's at the end of his life, and he's not going to be in the political scene for very much longer. And there is nobody legitimately that could be his predecessor. Nobody else could possibly fill the shoes of this man, because nobody could be that self-absorbed, I guess, And so people are going to have to reconcile that. And I see there's a lot of people in, the MAGA government and in the Republican Party, they're trying really hard to, capture some of that interest of the MAGA people and to lead them in a new direction that's diverged away from Trump, because Trump's, over. He's done. He is a lame duck president. He's worthless. He's a liability to any Republican that's trying to get, voted back in the midterms or get elected in the midterms, and people are starting to realize the weak and feebleness of Trump. His old age is definitely kicking in. It's showing clear indicated signs that he's just waning in his capacities. And so people are starting to look at him less as this like strong man that could get things done, and more like this guy that, doesn't really have the capacity to do much except for like go to his default mode of, playing real estate agent in remodeling everything, and no real clear sense of what sort of policies can be created. And everybody in his administration are just yes men doing, what Trump says, this is what our policy is going to be, and then you have these other few actors that are exploiting the, senility of Trump and really like playing shadow president, and doing some really bad things, because these people would never be able to become president, never, ever. So they're just trying as best they can to get their crazy, wacko, hardline, cruel agendas passed through Trump. Trump doesn't care. He has no reputation to protect politically, and he's at the end of his life. He's gonna live fine going to sporting events and golfing all the time until the end of his days. He doesn't care about what happens in consequence for America. He's setting himself up in this, prime situation where the whole world is feeding him, his oyster or whatever. That's why I think he's less interested in what's happening politically. He's like, I don't know about that race or whatever, and he's barely giving people, endorsements or whatever. He's not really involved, and whenever he goes out and does a public speaking, it's just like grievances and complaints and a bunch of incoherent babble, and he doesn't really have an objective or a plan, and it's just excuses and blaming Biden because that's like all that they have in their toolkit to do. And so all these other people that are trying to come in to fill those shoes, there really is nobody that can do it. And there are some really extreme hardliners that are trying to take MAGA into this like new direction where they can just like get rid of all the worst parts of Trump but take all the powerful aspects of allegiance and just point it and direct it in this direction. And then, this body of MAGA, deep, loyalists are going to be able to make, the next series of presidents, and America is going to be this new standard set of like, deeply entrenching the sense of Christian white nationalism and, violence, and the new orientation with the global order, more aligned towards, being besties with Putin and all these other things. Like, none of those things are in the best interest of America. It's really not. The old world order doesn't exist anymore because Trump threw our American reputation in the shitter, and we'll never be able to bring that back. But my hope is that enough of the people who are dissatisfied and disappointed in Trump for his failings with Epstein will be able to come to their senses in a reasonable way that we can get them to consider an alternative to what MAGA, represented. Instead of this like crazy, mean, like us versus them, violent belonging, why not come into a belonging that is a situation that you can thrive on, that actually helps to make sure that America works for everyone without the disadvantage of anyone, so that nobody gets left behind and nobody gets kept behind and everybody lives the good life, in a sense of like, you belong in an America like that, because that's the America that you deserve, because it's an America of prosperity and, thrivability, in a nation that's focused on habitability and livability of our cities, vitality of life, and the accessibility of our life vital resources, and the integrities of our economic systems that are assurances and insurances and robust resilience, and a fortification, things that are standard that you can bank on, that the legitimacy and the predictability of markets and standards and ideals and guidelines and what we're working towards. And it's like, I can plan out for the future on that. I can stake a claim on that. I can hedge my bets here. I can build on that. I can take an entrepreneurial approach to advancing this in this way or whatever. And everybody can see a way of belonging and involving with that doesn't require them to hate vast portions of the population, or to single anybody out for discrimination, or to be mean and cruel to people, or to, discount certain individuals' rights or liberties, or to be forced to have to make a decision of whether or not you can align with, your friends and your family and your loved ones and the people you care about, or, your friends, or, your fellow citizens. Like, you don't have to choose between, being able to involve yourself with them because you are no longer aligned with the political affiliation that says that you have to hardline in these areas, and you're either with us or you're against us. Or to alienate your friends and your family to the point where they can no longer associate with you because you've taken your sensibilities about politics into the extreme where, it has become your whole life. Even if you don't talk about it all the time, it becomes your whole life to the point where you cannot be yourself without involving yourself in that, MAGA paradigm. Like, you're cutting yourself off from enriching, thriving relationships and good human experiences because that host, that thing, that parasite that's leached onto you has become the dominant driving force of your decision making and your way of living, and it really isn't fulfilling the things that you truly want. Why? Because you're dissatisfied. How do I know that? Because you're attacking other people, especially when you see them, getting a better deal than you, so you think, or whatever. The world's so unfair, and you're going to be mad at them, so you want to attack them because it's unjust, instead of looking at the situation as like, man, like, the system's unjust for everybody, and it's not any one person's fault. Fuck, it's all our fault. Excuse my language. It's all of our fault. This is what happens when you misplace trust in political demagogues that really don't have a clear plan to make America great or even pretty good. They just want to get in power so they can, fuck shit up and rig things into their favor. And they don't really care about you. They don't sit and think about, like, wow, I wonder how the little old lady that lives in the rural community that just had, the last thriving, industry there, shut down the manufacturing plant that's employing, 70% of the population there, and that little old lady depends on the thrivability of that city and that community in order for her to just be able to get by. Like, what is she doing, and how is she reconciling her life if that, now the nurses that are there that come and take care of her have to move out of town to somewhere else to get more viable jobs, and who's going to be there to take care of her? You don't have people in the MAGA party that are thinking on that level. They don't care about you. And it's so frustrating, because we could have such a great America, America the Great. if we could just focus on doing what's good for the outcomes of everybody, secure a situation of thrivability for everyone. Let it be a welcoming situation. You don't have to be, political cult this or that, I literally don't care about the political left or the political right. I don't care about the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. I care about the responsible party. And I care about the sensibilities. It's like we have to be able to have this wide and diverse population of people of varied experiences, perspectives, perceptions, propositions, all of that. This is a robust resiliency. That variation is what makes our American society thrive, But I see it not as a weakness that we are different. I see it as our integrity, it's our strength, it's our resiliency, it's our fortification. Because no one person can do everything, but everybody can do something, and everybody has a special gift and talent unique to themselves, and we need all hands on deck to be able to do the best we can, work-wise, to get done what's necessary to build out a future that is stable, a secure situation everybody can thrive on, because there's many variables that are altering and changing outside of America way beyond our control. America's even losing its capacity to bully people around. Trump is using up all of that capital that we gained, wasting away all our soft power. We don't have the capacity to influence the global stage like we used to, and the intimidation factor of having, the biggest, best, most powerful military is not going to be enough to be able to protect our asses from the unknown variables, especially if we're pissing everybody off and we're making enemies out of our former friends. So we're putting ourselves in a precarious situation by trusting that Trump has our best interest when he goes out there and negotiates on our behalf in the global stage. We're being set up for failure, not success. And so we have to start looking into ourselves. Again, the whole concept of America first. How about first America gets its house in order so that we can take on the challenges that are external from us? I think one of the best ways to approach that is by giving America a new identity that we can share in, that isn't MAGA, Democrat, Republican, liberal, progressive, and none of those things. But an American identity that isn't based off of political ideologies, but just a sensibility of this is who we are, because this is what we're about, this is what we're doing together as a collective, and we all have our part to play. We all belong in this America. That's welfaring stewardship, where we're stewarding a situation. Well, everybody is faring well in their lives. They're doing good, pretty good, right? We want to work out it so that America works for everybody without the disadvantage of anybody, so nobody gets left behind, kept behind, and everybody lives the good life. And you do that by provision, accommodate, steward, support, and care about all people. And, America working for everybody is our diversity, and so as nobody gets disadvantaged. That is about equity, and so that nobody gets left behind. That is our inclusion. These are important things, and it's the sensibility is it's what's just, fair, reasonable, right for everybody. It's make sure that we're equal under the law. We're entitled to, equal benefits of a collective society, of resource commons that says this is the mutual benefits that we build together and that we can tap into together, and we can use it as a resource pool by which we can grow and develop new things so that we can advance in society and surpass other forms of government and civilization development in society. We want to be the ones that determine You know, where are we going as a collective human species? And we want that to be in a good direction, you know, because in the competing interest of all these different nations that are like trying to be powerhouses and push us in these ways and formalize certain ideals and conform people to certain ways or whatever, America used to be the standard of the leader of the free world, you know, because we represented, you know, what was the best that could be achieved at the time. We've lost that because we've gone through this reputational tarnishing by Trump trying to rebrand America as Trumpland. You know, everything's got his name on it now. And, you know, it's really devalued, you know, what we're good at here in America, which is our capacity to get shit done when it needs to happen, you know? Imagine how we all came together during COVID. Imagine how we all came together after 9/11. You know, imagine what we are capable of when enough of us are aware of the fact, oh fuck, we really are all in this together, and we really are all we got. And man, we gotta work together to do what's necessary right now, because, you know, help's not coming. And so the sensibilities of having an American identity, of this, you know, archetype that says, let's have this sense, this great ideal of we are stewarding together, you know, we're going to take ownership, we're going to take responsibility, and we're going to start doing the good and necessary work to build out an America that works for everyone. And I think that, you know, the only way we can do that is if we can all kind of like come on the same page, in such a way where we're no longer factioning or infighting. Because I don't want, you know, I want MAGA to be shrunk down to size. It's like a really huge egos filling an entire room that just needs to be shrunk down, you know. It doesn't necessarily have to like disappear completely. I just want, you know, the best aspects of it, the parts of it that bring out the best in people, I want to still exist, because it is a way of being that helps to diversify our sensibilities of the world, you know, the things that we look at and we consider and we care about. But get rid of all the useless and antiquated things, you know, the violent tendencies of it, you know, the otherisms, you know, the extremisms, like all those things no longer serve a purpose when we're stewards of society. You know, we're caregivers, you know, and we're caretakers and we're stewards of our society. So you can't hold on to those violent tendencies. You got to let those go. And it's not just MAGA that does it. There's violent extremists on the left too, you know. And I think with having this shared sensibility of this stewardship archetype is a way for us to at least know we have a way to settle our differences, so we don't have to turn to the extremes of more political violence, which has been proliferating and happening like crazy. And, you know, we owe it to the victims of political violence to tone things down intentionally in such a way that says, like, we really all are Americans, you know, and we really all do belong here, and we really do all have an obligated duty to uphold the Constitution, and we really all do have our part to play that's very important, to abide by social and civic ideals and to take on the responsibilities of doing the good work to make America work for everybody, you know. And again, it's not like, you know, punishing people or preventing them from growth and development, but it's encouraging growth and development, and do so along the lines of a standard that we can all agree to, you know. And with that, the next thing that I just said all those other things because I'm kind of avoiding wanting to even talk about this because it upset me so much tonight. But I can't let it go, you know, unaddressed. And that was a news segment that I heard from, again, my favorite, news media program, MS Now, and the conversation came from Lawrence. Now, I absolutely love Lawrence. I think he is a brilliant, well-versed, colorful character. I love the way he crafts his programs. I love his word choices. I think it's dynamic and it's compelling and it's sympathetic and it touches on like raw nerves, and it really does kind of like speak to like what the F are you doing to a lot of people, and so I deeply respect him. And with all that context, the segment that I heard tonight, and mind you, I didn't hear it in its entirety. I only took the little bit that they ever do show on YouTube. And in this segment, he was talking about apparently Scott Bessent went in, like, met before some members in Congress today, and it was, put the pressure on. I was asked questions about the economy, and so somewhere in that, this is where Lawrence found his hitch, his piece, the thing that he was going to wrap all the story into today. And he drew in the context of Trump going to the, prayer breakfast this morning, and tied it in from that of being like, saying that Trump was surrounded around a bunch of people that a lot of them had this, Christian white nationalism ideological framework where they only believe that marriage should be between one man and one woman. And he drew in this, controversy in regards to Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, and how he's been married multiple times, and then looping it back into saying, these Christian white nationalists don't, support, multiple marriages, and then tying it in with Bessent, saying that, Bessent is a man who's married, in a same-sex marriage and has children, and that many of the Christian white nationalists are not okay with that. They think it's like, morally wrong and all these other things, and man, that sat with me wrong. And I know his intentions were good. It wasn't like he was trying to, like, I didn't even have the sensibility that he was playing like some moral high horse with it or something. It just didn't sit with me right. And I think it was because somehow I needed to give voice to my considerations of that, especially because I was deeply impacted by what went down in that, prayer breakfast. I heard what, the person who did the prayer that day, like, was praying on behalf of Trump, saying, like, just help him to, have better guidance, care about everybody in America, not, we're all in this together, be conscious, compassionate, these sorts of things. It was a beautiful, wonderful, compelling prayer that I don't think seeped through into Trump, but it was still very courageous and beautiful words, and it spoke to my heart. It really, really did. And, it definitely inspired me in what I said in response to that, is just like, I really just wish we can settle our disagreements in such a way where it's like, we don't have to be so split and factioned anymore. I want to be able to, bring everybody back into the whole embodiment of the human family. Like, I don't want anybody to be left behind. That's a deep soul print value for me. Like, it's important, but I don't want people to try to come into our house and fuck shit up. So it's like, I just want you to be your best version, and I want to bring that out in you and see you succeed in those terms and conditions, and for you to not, infringe on other people's sensibilities of their best version, like, to each their own, and let, the best of us prevail, the best in each of us prevail. And so, like, I made comments and speaking to that, like, hoping for the best, really truly praying for these people, because, like, I'm hoping they're going to come to their personal day of revelation, you know, and by divine providence, they will be touched by the hand of God, and they will wake up to their sensibilities and be like, oh shit, I've been doing it wrong, haven't I? Time to recourse. And set themselves on a path of redemption and restoration and reintegration, and then we can come back together as a whole human family and do the right thing together. You know, and I really hope for that. And it seems so like, oh, that's just so easy. Like, but to me, it's like, yeah, it is. It's that simple, but it certainly isn't easy. I mean, I just talked about all the hard work we're gonna have to do just to reconcile the whole Epstein debacle. Like, this is not an easy task, guys. You know, it's hard work, it's necessary work, but me seeing that there's a path to accomplish it, to me, it's like, it's so simple, you know? And I just want to be able to invite people into that situation that we can all thrive on. And so that's how I took that day, and it was just like, yeah, I really do hope for the best. I really do hope that Trump wakes up one day and decides to do things differently, and then decides to approach his best version, you know, and he starts to turn things around and really work with intent to bring about an America that can be great, that we can all be proud of, and that we can all belong to, and we can all involve in, and we can all get behind, you know, and that we could be proud of, and then, you know, his name on everything wouldn't be a disgrace to us, and we could just be like, yes, we're so glad that, you know, he really was there for us. He did right by America, you know, like, I really hope for that, you know. But hoping for something, you know, and having faith in the universal, you know, scenario universe, for that to be plausible, like, the predictability pattern for that really reveals a low ratio of success. It's possible, yes. You know, potential, absolutely. You know, high degree of probability, not so much. But, you know, the hope is still there, and I think that we could collectively foster it and bring that out in him, bring out the best in him. But right now people have the input-output wrong. Like, they're allowing him to bring out the worst in them instead of us inspiring the best in him and bringing out the best in him so that he can do right by us, we can do right by him. Mutual reciprocity, you know, mutualisms. But anyway, so, you know, to this concept of this brunch, you know, had already had my gears turning for the day, and it was just like, you know, I wasn't taking it from a perspective, like, I didn't even consider it until Lawrence mentioned it, like, these are, like, you know, religious people. To me, it's like, it's spiritual, you know, it's always spiritual. I'm not a religious person by any stretch of the imagination. I'm a very spiritual person, but I respect all religions, and I totally understand where they're coming from in the original spirit of intent, and from that place is where I perspective it. But when the religiosology comes in, and then it's like, our religion's right, ours is right, we gotta take the Bible seriously and literally, you know, and every context, and it's like, that to me is extreme dogmatism or dogma, and it's a stigmatism on society. It's not healthy, and it's not reasonable, you know. It distorts a person's sensibilities because, like, their situational context, their historical context, and their fine context is always oriented to that being the absolute truth, when in reality it's like, this is, you know, a human-made construct. There's fallibilities to it, you know, it's not perfect, and the only way to truly know, I mean, for Christ's sakes, the Bible even says the only way to know the Father is through the Son, and the only way to know the Son is through the, you know, sensibilities of going into spirit, you know, to emulate, so that you can follow the patterns and be blessed by it and be risen into the Christ consciousness, to be aware of, like, this is as close to divinity as a human can be, you know, and to live in that sensibilities of pattern, you know, and conform to, you know, the reasonable laws, rules, terms, and conditions of, like, the commandments, because that gives you pattern so that you can live within the sensibilities of the Christ consciousness. And, you know, to me, that's what it's about. But, like, the Bible even tells you that it's not the Bible that is, you know, the thing that you have to, like, base, you know, everything on. It's, like, the internalized sensibilities, the personal development of, like, this consciousness of right and wrong, you know, what is the best thing to do in a given scenario context. That's why the parables exist. It's supposed to be, how can you wrap your head around this human problem and solve for it in a way that it's like, okay, I get it. You know, a proverb is much information distilled into very few words. And so when I look at religion, I look at it on that level. You know, that's what the Quran is. That's what the Bible is. You know, that's what the Torah is. That's what, you know, every Buddhist text is. You know, that's what the Emerald Tablets were. It's like, all of it is just this external patterning to help us to internally register, that's why I feel that way. That's why my mind goes in that direction. Like, oh, that is right, wrong, got it. You know, it forms your conscience and your sensibilities about orienting yourself and relating to the world and others and things like that. It's like, to take it so literally is dogmatic, and that's problematic, because then you are adhering to a pattern that other people have created for you that maybe isn't the best way for you to internalize your access to the higher power. You might be cutting yourself off from God by living so dogmatically, right? So, like, I pull from many different religious texts and faith beliefs and traditions and things like that, because I think all of them have their own brilliant insights, you know? It reminds me of one of my favorite books, which is called The Celestine Prophecy. And it's a whole series of books, and in one of the series it talks about how all of the religions, you have to take the best out of each one of the religions and form them together into this cohesive perspective, way of viewing the world and experiencing and living out the world in such a way where it's like no one body of being is right, but enough of it together is like we understand the importance of upholding this, you know, religion and its traditions and beliefs and things, but to respect each and every one of them as being like, you know, different versions of the same thing, so to speak. And so, like, to me, it wasn't even a consideration of like, oh, this is one religion that's meeting today and having this prayer lunch. But when Lawrence led to the idea that there was like Christian white nationalists there, and those people are so hard on for these different, you know, stances, it was like, oh yeah, I hadn't even thought about that. And it troubled me, you know? Because again, like, I understand the dangers of, you know, this movement of Christian white nationalism. It's like this sense of superiority, like, you know, you're the superior race, and, you know, you're the superior religion, and you're God's chosen people, or something like that. And like, no, like, none of that really like works itself out in any reasonableness, because it's like take for instance Israel. You can't really look at these people as being the chosen people when they're like slaughtering innocent people. Like, God certainly isn't looking to you in positive favor if like the whole Bible is talking about, you know, thou shalt not kill, but you're slaughtering people. Like, you're walking hypocrisy, and the whole Bible says hypocrisy is a bad thing. It's a form of evil. So like, I don't really think God's gonna come and be choosing you anytime soon for any sort of, you know, special interest privilege or something like that, you know. And then the Christians think, oh, we're gonna all ascend to some magic place in the sky, and the whole world's gonna be judged, but we're gonna be enlightened because we're the Christians and we know what's right. And it's like, no, I think that like the whole sensibility is like those who are able to access Christ consciousness are going to be able to see from a, you know, overview effect perspective and be like, oh shit, Lots of humans are making a lot of mistakes and refusing to correct themselves. And yeah, they're going to have a personal day of revelation, and it's going to be a really hard trial and tribulation that they're going to go through. And many of them are going to realize, oh shit, I fucked up. And there's not going to be enough time to be able to redeem that. And it's going to be unfortunate for them, And in the process, human suffering is going to occur because, if they could have just worked out their redemption, with fear and trembling, while they were, conscious decision makers in the world, they could have done the right thing by everybody, redeemed themselves, and hey, the world wouldn't be so messed up. We can do what the Bible says we're supposed to do, which is supposed to make heaven on earth. We can only do that if you're not assholes. So, thinking of it in that sense, it stuck with me. Like, it hurts my heart when I think that there are people that have distorted the interpretation of the language of the Bible as such that they think that it's okay for them to stand in the way of someone's personal life choices and their personal dominion. Personal dominion is a very important concept for me. It's something I think that we need to embed in our constitution so that the government doesn't have any standing to tell you what to do, what to think, what to feel, how to live your life, to invade your privacy, these sorts of things. It would help to settle a lot of our cultural issues or whatever in culture wars, because the government should not be able to, intervene in your life around decisions around your own body and your personal health care, or who you're going to love and who you're going to marry, and whether you do or you don't have children. Those are things that are part of the free will of a human, and the law isn't supposed to, God gave us free will, gave us some commandments. Yeah, don't do these things because that's the worst. Just don't do those things. Pretty simple. That's why we have laws. Laws are important. But the law should never infringe on a person's, personal liberties and individualities and self-expressions and sense of personhood. That's why I don't think that the government should ever have the capacity to tell you who you can and you cannot marry, whether you can or you cannot have children, what you are or you aren't going to do with your own body. No, that's personal dominion. That's the individual's choice. Government can intercede on your behalf if your personal choices are becoming detrimental to society as a whole, or you're going to cause, harm to other individuals, prevent them from, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Yeah, intercede on our behalf in that regard, but not to tell people whether, they can choose to have an abortion or not, because the government should have the separation of church and state, because the church will be corrupted by the state if those two intermingle too much. Ethics for government, morals for people. It's okay to be a moral politician, but you can't create, moral laws. Like, laws have to be ethical, just, fair, reasonable, right? Boundaries, yeah, that's ethical, but you can't moralize the world through law. And, the Bible doesn't even do that. It just tells you, like, these are ethical guidelines. You probably shouldn't be treating people like pieces of shit, because do unto others, right? The two most important rules, the golden rule, the platinum rule, treat others as you want to be treated, treat others as they want to be treated. And it's as simple as that, in my opinion. But so I'm trying to come to terms with the fact that I know that there are these people, based off of how Lawrence, presented his conversation, weaving from that storyline, pivoting into, just showing, like, Trump is surrounded by all these people that are morally dubious in the eyes of, the most extreme versions of Christian white nationalism. So it's like, he was just a hypocrite being up there, and yes, all of that is true, when put in that light. But, man, we shouldn't be trying to enforce the moralization of the people who are, themselves not adherents to it. Like, you can say you're a Christian, but you don't necessarily follow Christ's values. And so, like, are you really a moral, role model for good humanity? No, you're not. And in that regard, like, people should be deciding, probably not a trustworthy person to entrust as a caregiver over society, you know, by being a politician and elected official, you know, governing on our behalf, making decisions on our behalf. You know, if they can't even make decisions in terms of, like, abiding by the religion that they've said that, you know, they're an adept to, like, you know, you probably can't trust that they're going to uphold their obligations and duties for office if they can't uphold the obligations and duties of their religion. You know what I'm saying? But to show that, like, these people, the Christian white nationalists, reject the idea of many of the lifestyles that people in Trump's cabinet live, like, it really frustrated me, because it's like, I don't want Christian white nationalism to get a foothold, because it's insanity, in my opinion. It's crazy, it's extreme, it's ridiculous, it's dogmatic, and that is problematic. And, you know, I really do believe in the separation of church and state. I think it's the most powerful delineation that helps us to be able to remain free and independent and liberated people, you know. Social sanction people, totally fine. You know, if you want people to join your religion and live by your beliefs and value systems, be compelling enough in society through roots and culture to be able to change hearts and minds to compel them to follow in such, you know, ways of being. Totally fine, but you can't expect everybody to do that, and you cannot, like, create laws that conform people to live in a way because it suits your religious sensibilities. It just doesn't even make sense. You know what I'm saying? So it's important, in order to, like, really preserve and protect the precious value that religion has to so many people's lives, in terms of how it enriches their lives and helps them to become better people. Like, there's so many good parts of religion. You know, don't let it be perverted by them turning it into this dark thing of, like, controls, you know, or, like, the threat of damnation in order to try to make you be a good person. It's like, no, society should be compelling one another to be good and have legal bounds to say, like, you know, thou shalt not kill, you know. Be reasonable about, you know, how we try to compel one another to live in such a way that we think would be, you know, suited and conducive to happiness amongst everybody. And then understand some people are just never gonna align with that, and that's why we need a diverse society that's big enough, with enough places that people can find their community and fit in and belong. And we're not always going to belong with one another, you know. And it's one of the most beautiful things about America. It's like religious freedom, and having a nation where it's like, come as you are, you know, come and practice your faith and your traditions. You know, we're not here to stop you from doing that, you know. But, like, be true to who you are. Live the life that you love. What's your happiness? Pursue it, man, you know. But just don't mess it up for other people, you know. And we understand sometimes people get a little out of hand, and they have this need to control, and their egos need to prove, and their ego defenses come up and flaring, and, you know, this worthless defense, like, and bad things happen when you put the wrong mixture of people together, and emotions flare. And so you gotta have balance, you gotta have limits, you gotta have laws, and you gotta have social sanctioning and these sorts of things. Totally reasonable, but, you know, not okay to try to, like, indoctrinate people with laws that, you know, force people to conform to a certain religious ideology. I'm not okay with that. And so when Lawrence was talking about, you know, same-sex marriage, and how Scott Bessent wouldn't be able to be married and to live in his relationship and have his children if this, you know, Christian white nationalism took over all of America. You know, he wouldn't have anywhere to be able to go, you know. But as it stands now, you know, fortunately enough, same-sex marriage is upheld nationally, and it has to be recognized in every state. But if that was to ever go away in a Supreme Court that was uber ultra conservative and was just like, moralize the world through law, and take that away, the only place that he would find belonging is in a democratic state that says, no, man, love is love, to each their own. That's your pursuit of happiness, more power to you. Doesn't change who I am as a person, you know, and good on you for knowing what's in your heart and being true to it and being able to live that out loud unabashedly, you know, and to not restrain your, you know, most beautiful, amazing expression of self-expression of personhood, you know, because there's a few people that might be uncomfortable with the idea, you know. They're not the one making, you know, living the life. They shouldn't be the one making the decisions for you, sort of thing. So that's where I very much believe this whole delineation of dominion will help us to resolve for that. So other people don't think that they have the right to boss other people around, tell you what to do, what to think, what to feel. Your way of life is wrong, you know. Socially sanctioned to like try to compel people to, you know, follow certain life, you know, patterns, sure, you know, but never in such a way that it says like, you don't conform to my life pattern that is a part of my religious indoctrinated pattern, and so therefore you don't get to exist in a free will state. We have to take away your choice, your life choice, because we need you to model our blueprints, because this is the type of society that is the only way to be. You know, there are some things that, yeah, we don't need murder in society, okay? Let's just all agree on that. I'm pretty sure we all can, you know, but like, you know what, it's not right to tell somebody that they can't marry the person that they feel compelled to. You know what I'm saying? I mean, imagine that. You know, when you understand love and you like, oh, I love you so much. Like you find a person that you deeply love, and then society tells you, don't do that. All of a sudden, you are forced into this terrible situation of conflicting your sense of what's right for you, your feelings, your emotions, your thoughts, your beliefs, like everything that seems so right to you. The others in society are like, don't do it like that. Why would you destroy somebody's pursuit of happiness in that way? You know? When those people who are trying to make life decisions for you that prevent you from being as true to who you are, when they go to bed at night, they're not living your life. They're not living out in the consequences of it. You know? And it's sick to me that to think that they would take pleasure in knowing that they forced you to not live out your happiness and not be true to who you are, that they would find joy or pride or happiness in it, or sense that they're doing the right thing. It's like, that's not right, man. America, we're founded off of the principle all people are endowed by their creator with inalienable rights. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. You can't take that away from anybody. I don't care who you are or what you stand for, what you believe in, what position of class status, you know, political, you know, powers you have in society. You don't have the right to tell somebody, you know, don't do that. Like, that'll make you happy, but it's going to upset me in my religious belief, and I'm not going to be able to reconcile it in my head knowing that there's people that exist in the world that live that way, you know, so you just don't do that and then I can be happy. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? Excuse my language, but really? You know? And so, like, I thought of Scott Besant with compassion, you know, and like, I don't like him. I don't. I don't think he's an intelligent person when it comes to economics. I think that he's a very confused man when it comes to, you know, how to perform, you know, the responsibilities and duties of his role. And I think that he has pledged his allegiance to Trump, and that he is willing to, you know, sacrifice the Constitution for the delights of one man that's very egotistical. I don't know what he gets out of that situation. Maybe an inflated sense of puffed up ego for himself. I don't know, whatever it is. That's not my consideration in this, but for the fact that I really had compassion for him, it's like, in a world that is, there's so many people that are against him in his way of showing up and choosing to show up and belong in the world, it's a difficult place for him. Maybe that's why he's aligned with this, because it's like, if he's close enough to the power, he's less likely to be directly attacked for this, that he might get a pass for these people, so it'll be okay because you're magnified enough that we don't have to attack you. But if he was just a little bit outside of the limit, he would be attacked. And then imagine what would happen to his family. How would he explain to his children that there's so many people out there that say that they're not allowed to be a family anymore, or that what they're doing in terms of being a family unit together is not okay? Like, I really feel for him. And it's not just, there's so many people in the United States that are in that situation, right? It's like, in the, legal and moral legitimacies of why same-sex marriage is a thing, is because we should not be imposing our, ideologies on people if it's, hindering them from pursuing their happiness. That really, in the terms of how does this consequent out in everybody's daily lives? It doesn't hurt anybody for them to be happy together, as a family unit. And their children should be able to grow up in an America that is embracing of that relationship and doesn't judge them negatively because of that, but really just oh, that's cool, doesn't look at it as anything that's different or wrong or perverse. No, that's cool, man, you be you, that's awesome, that's not the way I live, it's not the way I've chosen to be, but right on you, man. You know who you are enough to just be yourself unabashedly and go out there and do your thing. Good on you, And so it really stuck with me when he said it that way, because it made me feel sympathy for Scott, and just it made me feel a tinge of fear for him and his family, of that if MAGA gets, even a deeper foothold in society than it does, they'll run out of bodies on the other side to attack, that eventually that concentrated power and the belonging is going to shrink, and him and his family is going to be on the outside of it. And then by that time, they're going to be so much more extreme. This magnification is going to be so much more extreme. And the things that they'll do to the people that are newly distinguished as easy targets of the out group. I fear for his family in that scenario. It's terrible to even think about it. But there's so many people right now that are living that experience, and it's a dreadful place. It's a terrible circumstance. Nobody should ever be put in a position where, they have to hide who they are in order to, get along in the world without becoming a target for somebody's hatred. Especially when it comes to the factors of love, There's absolutely nothing wrong with being attracted to whoever you're attracted to be sexually compelled in one orientation or another, or many, and who you love. Love is love, man, as long as it's adhering to, you're not, sexually exploiting or sexually abusing or raping people or pedophilia or statutory rapes and these sorts of things. Those are obviously not okay. you know? And we have laws and rules that tell us nope, and consequence and corrective mechanisms, and we're not tolerating that. Zero tolerance. You know, at least that's the way it should be. But there's no justification to say, like, you know, if you're a man that's married to a man, that's all of a sudden not okay. No, it's perfectly fine. If that's your pursuit of happiness, bless you, you know? And children can be raised by one parent, two parents, many parental figures, you know? As long as you have, you know, loving, caring, you know, adults that are there to raise children through child development, through adolescence, you know, into their youth and their teen years and on through their life as this loving, supportive figure of, you know, stability and care and reliability and love and connection and relation, like, you know, in this honest and true and respectful, you know, and innocent sense, like, there's nothing wrong with that. And so that really sat with me. And I just knew that I had to say something about it because, you know, like, I am absolutely an ally. I myself have been single for a very, very long time. I was married once. I got divorced, you know, and it took a long time before I could reconcile it, you know, and I finally found a passage in the Bible that helped me to come to terms with, like, God does not want you to be married to the wrong person, you know. There's the right person is being prepared just as you are preparing yourself for the right person. And, you know, I very much believe when you're living the life that you love, you will find the love of your life. And I certainly didn't love my life when I got married, you know. I was far too young to be able to make that informed decision, you know, and it was a mistake. And I paid severely for it, you know. And this passage that I read in the Bible, and you know, I have it somewhere written down. I don't remember and recall it exactly because it was kind of just like, as soon as I read it, it was like, oh, yes, good. God forgives me. Like, I don't have to punish myself for, you know, getting divorced, you know, because the right thing in God's world paradigm is, you know, this universe is that, you know, you should not be married to somebody who does violence against you. God does not want for that, for the basic and simple reason, first and foremost, of, like, in a suppressive, oppressive, violent, abusive situation, you cannot self-actualize your best version, and God needs you at your best. And so never would it ever be justified for you to remain in such a, you know, limiting, confining, constraining situation. You know, that is giving yourself over to the evils of the world, you know, and sacrificing yourself victim to the evils of the world, and actually preventing from the actualization of the manifestation of a Christ consciousness through you. Because there's no way when you're in a suppressed, oppressed, abusive state that you can ascend into the full Christ consciousness. It is not possible, you know. And reading that and realizing that through the Bible, it was just like, I lost so much of that sensibility of, like, guilt. Like, I should be guilty for myself. Like, I got married and I made this commitment and I should, you know, stick to that no matter what. And, like, I was convinced because, like, this version of Christianity told me, like, no. And then I read this passage and I was just liberated in a sense of, like, of course God would never want me to be in this oppressive situation where evil abounds, you know, and I'm this sacrifice to the propagation of evil in the world, you know, by being this source of, you know, somebody else afflicting me with pain and suffering and abuse and, you know, continual suppression and things. And it's just like, God would never want that. And it's the right thing to do to leave the situation, because it is the only chance ever for the abuser to be able to be liberated, so that they can be redeemed. As long as the scenario exists in which you obviously don't belong together, you know, like you're making it impossible for either parties to be able to actualize your best version and to become everything that God wants and needs you to be to fulfill the great creative purpose. Your purpose is not here to suffer and to, you know, be in pain and ashamed and all these things. So when I heard Lawrence say in such a way that as if Pete Hegseth, you know, being married multiple times went against the sensibilities of these Christian white nationalists, and, you know, that made Trump and his entire administration this walking, talking hypocrisy standing in front of all of these people at this prayer breakfast. It was like, I sense, and from my understanding, Pete Hegseth was probably very much aligned with the similar characteristics of my ex-husband, who was also military and a very violent person. And I'm assuming that that his marriages fell through because he wasn't a good person and was in that scenario where he was, you know, perpetuating evil and violence in those relationships. And so they ended because they were meant to end, you know. And I don't know him, but this is just based off of what I have come to understand about him and his character. I judge him harshly because I think that he is a deeply flawed individual who is arrogant, egotistical, and he is a tremendous threat to the stability and national security of America because he's rash, irresponsible, and completely ego-driven, and has a tendency of violence. So, but all that aside, you know, yeah, I have harsh judgment for him because, you know, he should do better, could do better, he chooses not to. But where it really stuck with me and I had a problem was that, like, by casting him as if, you know, he was illegitimate to be in front of this prayer group, or to be amongst that prayer group, and then for, you know, his boss, you know, to be in front of the prayer group, and they're all just hypocrites. By canceling out Pete Hegseth, it also, like, bunched in his prior wives in the sense of, like, they couldn't be socially accepted in that environment either. And that bothered me, you know? And it bothered me that he seemed to imply that, you know, under the terms and conditions of these Christian white nationalists and how they think of the world, you know, you're undeserving of trust because, you know, you can't uphold the moral ideologies of, you know, a marriage is between a man and a woman and only one man and one woman. And then suddenly it casts his, you know, ex-wives into this alienated position. And I just don't think that they should have to, like, you know, suffer from the consequences of his bad decision making. But also in a sense of, like, you know, I really think that I very much believe in, you know, marriage and monogamy and, you know, working through your relationship and, you know, really looking at marriage as, you know, a lifelong friendship with your life companion who, you know, stands at your side and back to back and, you know, is there for you and with you, and you're facing the same direction together. Like, it's a deeply, like, beautiful, intricate interrelationship, and it develops and evolves over time. And that's why I knew I wasn't married to my life partner when I got married, because I had not known him enough to even be able to understand him on even a level to be able to say, are we looking at the world in the same direction? And I don't think that any person should be judged as being untrustworthy because they got a divorce. Sometimes the realization is that there's just no way that you can move forward together in the same direction. And if you can't do that, if you can't evolve together, if you can't stay involved with each other and committed to, live out your life independently but interdependently, marriage isn't for you. And that the right person is still out there. And so it stuck with me, it bothered me. That context. And again, I'm not trying to say that, Lawrence was wrong. It's just the way that he said it was very, very, very thought-provoking, and he's very good at doing that. That's why I love, respect, and appreciate him so much, and appreciate his work. But the way he broke it down, it was hard. But I wanted to make this video and emphasize, like, the fact that my convictions are as such that I believe that, your life decisions of who you choose as your life partner, which isn't just like this conscious thought. Yes, it's conscious, but it's also like this sense of like knowing, and there's no external factor that can determine that for you, for who you're going to feel that towards, who you're going to be connected with, who you're going to be compelled towards, who's going to make your heart sing. Like, you don't get to decide that. It is this complex, way of being and showing up in the world. And the more true to who you are, and the more authentic to who you are, the more that resonates, and the more your heart sings and just leads you to where you belong, to be the best service to the world, and to find that person that can stand with you and face the world together in the same direction. And that sort of beautiful, natural, magnificent magic is not possible in a paradigm, a sociological or political construct that limits you from being able to feel that way about a person if that person doesn't comply to the, man, one woman, ratio or whatever. And so I wanted to express, like, I'm not okay with people not being okay with others pursuing their happiness, however that might be. This all folds into personal dominion, and I think that it would do us a great service in society to, embed that in our Constitution, that personal dominion is entirely up to the individual to decide for themselves, As long as it's not hurting or hindering other people's pursuit of happiness, to each their own. And I also don't think that it should be something that society should be able to, yes, socially sanctioned in terms of, like, you probably don't belong in a space of, somewhere where you don't feel like you can fit in or belong. But never should it be a matter of, like, segregation in terms of, like, you can't be here. You know what I'm saying? And then also the sense of, like, like one of the things that really bothers me is the way some people in the uber ultra conservative, Republican side, the way they treat what's her name, Sarah McBride, I think is her name, a congresswoman, and they disrespect her and misgender her and dead name her all the time. I'm not okay with that. She doesn't hurt anybody being true to who she is, and she is a brilliant intellectual, and she has brilliant intellect. Her human ingenuity is fantastic. She cares deeply about her constituents and takes her job very seriously, and to see conservative Republicans just be so disrespectful to her personhood really bothers me, because they do that to other people too, and I'm not okay with that. I'm an ally. Again, I support everybody's personal dominion and their personhood and how they choose to show up in the world. So I'm not okay with people that, attack a person because of how they choose to show up in the world. It was another thing that, President Trump decided it was important to bring up during his lengthy rambling, I don't even know if I really call it a speech, whatever it was, during this prayer breakfast event, was for him to talk about transgenders. It really disturbed me that he used the word mutilation of children to characterize gender affirming care as mutilation. Is a deeply disturbed mischaracterization, and it comes obviously from a place of ignorance, to not really know and understand what that's even entails. It comes obviously from a place of prejudice, but also from a place of who are you to decide on behalf of somebody else how they're going to choose to show up in the world? That's their personhood. That's their personal dominion. That's their choice in life decision. I do believe, I have a, scientifically backed sensibility as to what I think is appropriate in terms of when it would be reasonable to allow for the alteration of gender affirming cares. Again, going with your mental faculties are not fully developed until your age of 25, so I think that needs to be part of the determining factor, but also deeply respecting some people don't want to go through the pubescent development of their life in a gender that does not reflect their sense of who they are, and so I respect and I understand that, and that's why I think it really should be a personal decision that's left to their own devices in terms of having appropriate counseling and relationship with their doctor to make those decisions, because those are the people that are most informed and most likely that are going to be able to come to just, fair, reasonable, and right conclusions about what's going to be best for that person, and to make informed decisions. And I don't think that the government should be able to make decisions of what's going to happen to your body, So, and then the language is rude and offensive and violent to try to mischaracterize And I just think that there's a way more mature and responsible approach to that conversation. I definitely think it's an important conversation to have on the public stage. I just don't think it's something that we should go into extremes of, trying to make it out like it's okay for us to make the determination for somebody else on their behalf, rather than just saying, like, we need to understand how people are reaching those personal conclusions and allow for social sanctioning to say, like, are you sure that's really how you feel, and it's not just like this thing that society is making you think. Like, it should be free space to explore and discover whatever the answer to that is, but ultimate decision rests with the individual, always. Personal dominion. But I would really like to have a society where we don't have to have this constant conversation as if there's a political conversation we need to have about whether or not somebody can have control over their own body, which includes the conversation about abortion, which I know a lot of conservatives have a big hard time with, and uber, Christians are like, life at conception, and, we need to protect all life and these sorts of things. And, that's not how I interpret the Bible. Again, I'm not a religious person, but I am a spiritual person, and in terms of like the moralistic, sensibilities of what's just fair, reasonable, and right, especially in a society where, like, sometimes we do need to abort pregnancies because it's, the right thing to do, it saves lives and whatnot, and we need to have this. It's a life vital, necessary medical procedure, so it's important to have it in our, medical toolkit, and it should be accessible and available everywhere, because there are circumstances that arise in all different forms and fashions where that is a thing that must be, the resort that we turn to. But in the sensibilities of it being also a personal life choice and decision, and that a woman should have full control over her own body, and that until a fetus is developed so much that it can live outside of the womb of the woman, and live without supports on its own, and trend towards development of healthy development, like, it's not a viable life. And so there is no moral qualm as to whether or not, abortion can be conducted. If life can continue outside of the womb, without support, it's a viable life. And so we should have limits to, not have abortions at that point in time. But before that, I believe that there is no moral qualm, and so we shouldn't have, society trying to use that as an ends by which you can control a woman's body. Because the control of a woman's body is, the best way to suppress a woman, and it's the best way, best way meaning like the easiest way, the most direct way, the most, submissive and oppressive way would be to control her body. And so I believe that's more along the standards as to why people try to moralize that personal health choice, and to take away the decision of the individual that it impacts directly, which is the woman. And I also think that it's a way to try to morally reinforce the sensibility of, only a man and a woman should have a child in the family unit, and which goes into the sensibilities of, like, I would never want, Scott Benson to not have a family, to not have children, to raise them. Who knows? Maybe he's a great father, a great parent for all I know. But who's to say that he's not allowed to have that because it doesn't match with some, religious ideology? It's very much the same thing with, the concept of abortion. If you want to, hash it out in the social stage of saying, like, well, I don't think you should do that, and try to convince people, well, maybe there's other options, totally fine, but sometimes it is the only option. And the reality is there are many women who die unnecessarily, leave their other children, without a parent, leave their life partners, without their life partner because they end up losing their lives because they're not given the abortion that they need that would be a life-saving procedure. And so I don't think that the government should have any capacity to make that decision. I think it's a personal dominion decision and should rest ultimately with the individual. Barring, of course, the sensibilities of, like, well, if this is a life that is viable to live outside of the womb on its own, at that point in time we need to have a limit, and that's reasonable, and these are like the moral questions that society, culture wars over it or whatever. And it just came to mind tonight, like, I really need to emphasize this, speak, give voice to it in such a way that reinforces my sensibilities as to why I think that, establishing a constitutional amendment of personal dominion is very, very important for our society. It's going to solve for a lot of these things. We're not going to be able to politically infight with one another and use that as the mechanization to do harm to certain people or to, play games with people's lives in order to prop up certain political figures and ascend them into, roles of, power because they take a stance one way or another as to whether or not somebody has the right to make these personal life choices. Like, nah. We're supposed to be land of the free, right? We're supposed to be a freedom-loving nation. We're supposed to be leader of the free world. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, all of those things. And we made a government that was of, by, and for the people, not the political ideology or political party. The ultimate power our Constitution embeds leaves it with the people, and that the federal government and the state governments only get those powers that they derive from the consent of the governed, who allow them the permissibilities to retain that power because we agree mutually government ought to be the ones that make those decisions on our behalf because it's in our collective mutual best interest. But I argue it's not in the collective mutual best interest for the government to tell you what to do, what to think, what to feel, especially in regards to your own body and your own way of life. Barring, of course, again, the things that are just like sensibilities, like obviously we're not going to allow people to go around murdering people. And, we're already having a great public conversation about how we don't think pedophilia should be acceptable in society, or exploitation of young girls. And so, like, yeah, those are the sorts of things we should be making laws for. And how do we make those laws? Well, we legislate laws that we, the people, have said, hey, you know what? I really think we should have this law. And we all debate and dialogue about it, say, yeah, you know what? We really do. And then we create the language of a bill that then gets, hashed out through Congress of, like, the legal frameworks, like, how does this apply? Is this going to contradict something else? Is it enforceable? All these things. And then, and then turn it into legislation, vote on it based off of, well, I've listened to my constituents, I listened to mine, this is what they want, how they want me to vote, okay, well, this is what we're going to do, and then turn it into a law, and then you pass it. And then the governing bodies at the federal and the state level, and sometimes, even the local level, help to intervene on our behalf in those matters, of those public interest matters. Other than that, ultimate power rests with the people. And this is why I really, believe personal dominion is important, because it determines the individual is powerful, they have agency, they have the capacity to retain capital and resource, and, they belong. And we also need to, along with that, create the constitutional amendment to add a fourth branch of government, which is called civics. So civics branch of government, where all the people have a seat at the table to have the power to craft the frameworks for legislation, and then converse and work with directly their representatives in Congress, so that the language of the law is, conformable to our Constitution. But, has to pass through the people first, who say, yeah, this is the letter of the law that we can stand by and adhere to. We agree. We socially and civically inculcate these ideals. We can live by it, and be true to it. And then you turn it into law, and then, becomes the law of the land. And if we find for some reason, well, that's not working out as we thought it would, amendabilities are important for our laws. Whether to, sunset them out or to create new overriding laws, whatever the case may be. But having a seat at the table for the American people is really important, to make sure that the government really is reflecting the will of the people and working on our behalf. And to be able to be a corrective mechanism and an anti-corruption mechanism. So if government's not working like they're supposed to, not doing their job, you're out. And we have a means to make that happen. And that's important now more than ever. I really do believe. So, couple that, the civics branch, with personal dominion, and then enhance the concept of the Equal Rights Amendment, to really make sure that we are removing the barriers to, elections, so they really are free and they really are fair. And they are integrity bound, and they are systems that we can trust in. And so there's no room for, some, person to try to play on, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, to cast doubt in our systems and make people believe that, the election process is riggable or, corruptible or something like that, and then also deters people from voting, or to intimidate people from voting, or to just prevent people from being able to even register to vote. Those things, we shouldn't have those types of barriers. I really believe that the best way to make an integrity bound election system is to go across the board to a mail-in ballot system, modeled off the motor voter system, where you're automatically default registered to vote when you have a driver's license or a permit ID, a permit or an ID that is assigned to you by your state, because they go through the identification and verification process of your citizen status, and have all of your relevant information, your address, your signature, all the relevant information to know that you are who you say you are, and that you have the right to vote. And then you get a ballot mailed to you, and you fill it out, and you vote it, and then you turn it in to the post office that is, let's salvage and save it and improve what it does, where it has the intaking process for all the ballots. It's already, handling our most private information through the mail system, so it wouldn't be too hard to expand its duties and responsibilities and give it enough funding so that it can actually take on the task and the job. And then we remove a lot of the, problems of, there's no poll for somebody to go and to intimidate you, and people don't have to stand at the polls in crazy, ridiculous weather and bear the elements and be there for hours and take a whole day off of work and all this other stuff. It's like, no, you take the time, go through your voter's pamphlet, determine, you understand what you're voting for and who you're voting for and why, fill out your ballot and turn it in. You can either turn it in as a drop box or you can put it in the mailbox, and or have it picked up directly by your mail carrier. And for them to be certified in the capacity to collect that and be, held to a high standard of integrity and whatnot for it, like, it would be so much easier to build up the integrity of the systems doing it that way. And it would remove a lot of the barriers to accessibility for voting. And, the most important thing, of course, is remove the barriers for which somebody can receive an ID, through the DMV. And, have whole entire programs that are set up to help people to access their IDs if for some reason they don't have the financial capacity, or to help them to, gain access to the appropriate documents to be able to get that set up and really, like, understand where there could be hitch points, bottleneck points, and solve for that so that you can make it a streamlined, seamless, simple thing to do. So it doesn't deter people from voting. It actually makes it like the easiest, second nature thing to do. That's what we do in America. We're a democracy. Of course we vote, And to make it a regular thing, especially if we can create, this more direct democracy through a civics branch, we can have voting for more things than, just electing individuals. We can have say, kind of like we do at the state level, if, like, are we going to pass certain legislation or whatever. We can do that at the federal level too. And I think that would do really good to help us to not just make sure it's the will of the people, that the people and representatives are governing on our behalf, but also for the fact of, like, the people will understand what laws exist so that they can actually abide by them, right? And that's important. It's not just about the law existing, but the law being understood, easy to understand, and you can abide by it and adhere to it, and you understand the consequences if you don't, and these sorts of things. And that builds a consciousness in our heads of, civil society, and we can live out from that in such a way where it's like, my duty to my fellow Americans is to, abide by this. And if for some reason it ain't working, we have a path of recourse to say, I think we need to try something different that makes us, more malleable as a nation. And we gotta be that way. We have to have malleability, adaptability, so that we can have resiliency. We have to be able to, adopt new ways of being, befit the times, however it's appropriate. So I think all these things are possible by establishing a civics branch of government, and then, creating personal dominion as, the legitimate next level of governance, self-governance, right? And it's an insulary protection from local, state, and federal from coming in and imposing, infringing and interceding on behalf of the individual. It's like, first you have to pass the test of, like, does this infringe on my personal dominion? And then gives the individual a right to a legal standing to go in and defend themselves against people that would come in and try to tell them what to do, what to think, what to feel. It's like, oh yeah, you think you have that right? Well, argue it out in a court of law to say, like, why do you think you have that right? Because in general, it just falls under, this is personal dominion, argue the finer points of, like, how this is a public concern, and to have a legitimacy for that, and then also a means for a corrective mechanism for restitution for somebody who violates somebody's personal dominion, and I think that would go a lot farther to preventing people from doing harm to one another, knowing that, it really is a path of recourse to, you know, if people are infringing upon your personhood, that, you know, you have a means by which they could be stopped. It's important to have for a civil society. But with that, you know, just wrapping it all back, like, I'm very grateful for Lawrence having this conversation in this segment tonight, even though it disturbed me to the point where I was compelled I had to say something. But I think it's important because, again, it gave me capacity to give voice to reason as to my worldview and my way of relating with others, especially when it comes to my political philosophy. How I would see, like, the distinctions between my moral compass, my soul alignments, my principles, my beliefs, my strong sense of jurisprudence, and how that relates to how I would think that the law would need to be effectuated, how it would be exacted, how it would be enforced, how it could be implemented, and what sort of language could make a justifiable law, you know, just fair, reasonable, right. And I think that's really important for helping people to better understand me and who I am and where I'm coming from and what I'm all about, which is important in this rapport building, trust building exercise that we're involved in here. And then just like the touching on, because it wasn't really the thing that stuck out as a bothering me sort of thing in the conversation, but when Lawrence was talking about Scott Bessent, it was also talking about, you know, him being in this hearing and being confronted by Elizabeth Warren about, you know, the affordability concept and, you know, trying to get him, you know, speak, you know, on the merits about it, like, what does affordability mean and all this other stuff. And the thing that was frustrating about it was that, you know, they're passing the buck, like, excusing away what's happening in the economy as being, like, you know, the fault of somebody else. Like, this is, we're still living in the, you know, aftermath of past and prior decision making of a different administration. It's not our fault that things are this way, and, you know, no tariffs are, you know, the president's choice to enact those sorts of things, and it's not the reason why things are bad. We're still in the aftermath of other administration making bad choices, and it's like, actually, no, that's not the case. But the biggest thing about it that, to me, always stands out whenever I hear them talk about the economy under this Trump administration is, you know, they just don't care about how the economy is not working for everybody. In Trump's worldview, it's like, oh, everything's great because the markets are great, you know, stocks are up, whew, you know, I'm doing awesome, making lots of money in that way, and, you know, all the people that I do listen to and do care about, like these upper echelon of society, you know, they're doing great, so those are the only people I really care about, and shut up about affordability, you know, like, he doesn't think about everyday Americans that are suffering or struggling. So they have no plan to solve for that. They're not thinking about it. They're not concerned about it. America's doing fine. That's not the lived reality of most Americans, and, you know, we just have to accept the basic truth. They don't care. They're not making any plans. There's no help coming to solve for this problem. You know, they will be making matters worse because their focus, their intention, their purpose, their plan, their plot is about helping these people who already have accumulated hordes of capital, agency, and resource. And, you know, you hear Trump talk about people who, you know, have houses and wanting to keep the value of their houses going, and, you know, not going to lower the price of housing for other people to be able to get housing. It's their own damn fault. They didn't work hard enough to get a house. It's like, well, that's his mentality about everything when it comes to the economy. you're suffering and you live in want and you're, need for all these things, but you can't afford any of them because of your lack of working hard enough to earn enough money. When in society it's proven that, people who do nothing, make money off of speculation, are the ones who have the money to do everything, and then they buy up all the resources and make it too expensive and price everybody else out. That if you work a labor wage, the chances of you in the current standing of the economy to be able to accumulate property, assets, resource, beyond survivability is prevented. You're suppressed. You're not able to ascend. You're not able to get more. You're not able to get what you need. And it's by design that way. And so you're not a part of their consideration. They're not what they're, rigging systems to favor. They're leaving you by the side of the road, and they're perfectly fine with it because they just write you off as being like, you ain't working hard enough. And so that's your lot in life. It's not a lot, but it's your life. And so there's no help coming to be able to solve for the problems of the economy not working for everybody, as long as Trump is the one making the decisions, and the people who he's surrounding himself with that are helping to direct the policies that reflect the president's interests, they're not serving on behalf of the American people either. They're not going to step out of bounds of what Trump wants and what Trump values and what Trump thinks and what Trump believes. They're going to match what he says. And so they've already made it abundantly clear they're not going to do anything for anybody except for this very small, concentrated, elite group of people. And it's frustrating, and it's because it doesn't have to be this way, and America really can work for everyone. Nobody has to be disadvantaged. Nobody has to get left behind or kept behind. Everybody can live a good life. We have to make some adjustments to make that work. It begins with, reimagining our tax code system. I've made a video about it before. I think there's 3 simple, easy steps to be able to do that. You make a stewardship tax, you make a portions tax and an equilibrium tax, and then we can just keep everything nicely conformed in such a way where we can whittle down our deficit, we can fund all the programs that we need, we can make sure that everybody has the necessary scaffolding to level up their lives, to live a criterion standard in society of the good life, and keep everybody in checks and balance so they don't get deviate into an excess that then suppresses everybody else's capacity to just live well, and then having an approach to an extent. I agree with Trump in the sense of I don't want people who own houses to have to give up the value of their houses in order to make the market more favorable for people who don't own houses yet. The best way to solve for this is to be able to increase our housing stock, and we do that by drawing down the cost of being able to build new homes and draw down the cost of being able to remodel existing homes, make some of them that are currently in an unlivable state into a habitable state, so we can get more housing online and accessible, and then to have a pathway to home ownership legitimately standardized and built up in society, and then to do away with the slumlord landlord scenario where people in a renter situation can't be exploited, and a capacity for there to be a cooperative development for people to level up into home ownership. And there's so many different brilliant programs that we can enact to be able to do that, where it isn't forcing people to lose value in their homes in order to, bring them down to a level in order to rise other people up. Instead, it's finding that equilibrium of how can we retain the value of these homes but bring more homes online, and do so in such a way where we're taking the value from something else that is more fluid and not tangibility, because we want to move houses away from commodification, and so we want to standardize them as this value generating thing, a way to generate and build generational wealth and things. in a holistic wealth sense, but to not let them housing stock be so commodified that, you know, large hedge funds can buy up massive properties and then price people out of home ownership. Those sorts of things shouldn't be, you know, happening in society. So really, like, work in the system in terms of, like, you know, not everybody wants to be a homeowner, but everybody should have that choice and have a viable pathway to get there if that's what they want. And for society to have a scaffolding for the lives to be able to level up into that, and society just, like, make enough houses to do it. So we gotta approach it in a dynamic way. We need to build up the labor force and the, you know, blue-collared workforce, and we need to build up the entire industries of, you know, skilled craftsmen and, you know, journeymans and these sorts of things to build up the capacity to actually build these houses, you know, work on the permitting system, streamline these sorts of things, streamline so much of it, you know, and make it in such a way as, like, the objective is housing everybody. And the approach that we take is where we build in the efficiencies. We don't just, like, say it's too expensive to do it. We don't build enough houses. We build the houses to the capacity where we can create the efficiencies in the systems that make it affordable across the board for the entire nation. Because we need lots more housing so we can deal with this houselessness issue that we have. But, you know, drawing on these, like, brilliant approaches to solve for these sorts of things, like, we can take on these problems in an innovative approach. Like, I'm not one for throwing money at problems. Like, to me, that is the dumbest way to say that you're solving something, because you're not. You're just creating a concentration of the power and influence of money to corrupt people, to misappropriate funds, you know, fraud, waste, abuse, all those things. I think that building up innovations and then creating the efficiencies in the systems to reduce the cost of those innovations in terms of how they can be deployed and developed and built out, and then create the efficiencies in the systems in terms of, like, standardizing a lot of the development, not in a sense of creating cookie cutter homes or, you know, how Russia has it where, like, every, you know, apartment building looks the same or whatever, like, but, you know, diversifying, absolutely, bringing out the character of communities and things like that, but also understanding there's certain things that you can standardize in a house because most all houses have to have the same types of amenities. Approach, you know, creating, you know, similarities and efficiencies in the manufacturing and the processing and the developing and the building. There's so many different ways you can approach it, and, you know, bringing up the labor force that's able to do the work, and then opening space for entrepreneurship to develop out different types of companies that can build the component parts to be able to build these houses in a fast, effective, efficient way. And then to raise the standard to say houses have to meet a certain stewardship standard, to say, like, we're not building houses that are going to make the, you know, mess up the environment, or, you know, not be able to, you know, protect against the elements in a climate changing scenario. It's not resilient against fires or floods or storms or things like that. It's like we build for longevity and durability and integrity and quality. You know, really make the American-made brand be about building in that that dimension and really focusing on it, and then splitting between the, you know, efficiencies and the affordabilities, because usually it's, you can either do things fast, build it fast, build it of quality, or build it affordable or cheap, and you only get to pick two out of that paradigm. But you can, if you optimize for quality, can split the difference between efficiency and affordability and get a variable dynamic of, like, a high quality, you know, mass producible, you know, decent enough where you're not going to be building too much in quantity and you bring things out of control in terms of, like, having too much stock, but you're not moving so slowly, you don't have enough stock, and you're making the compromise that it is going to cost us some money, but instead of it being direct consumer cost, we might be able to like spread the cost out, and share it amongst us in such a way that optimizes systems that can catch the efficiencies to draw down the price, so that at the consumer level it costs less for an individual to purchase, but it costs us a little more in terms of investment of building up the systems to create the efficiency so it can be cheaper when it's mass produced, and splitting that difference between it, we get the whole trifecta. We just are majorly focusing on quality, durability, and longevity, sustainability, resilience, and these sorts of things, because that's the thing that's going to be enduring, because we'll have to, maintenance will be cheaper, we'll have to rebuild less often, it's risk averse in terms of like it's less likely that it's going to be damaged or destroyed or something like that because of elemental weather events that are beyond our control. Like all of these things you optimize for, and then really focus on like implementing that and calling to service, the entrepreneurs of the world, and productivity, enterprising, towards those outcomes that we're trying to engineer for. We need to increase our housing stock, we need to eliminate houselessness, and we need to make sure that we are shifting housing from a commodification into a resource commons so that everybody can be housed, and to limit the portions by which can be commodified, so we don't lose out on that entirely, because real estate is, a viable economic industry, and, optimizing for it in such a way that like we would never allow for the design of an industry system that, is wholly focused on turning a profit that in turn leaves whole populations of people by the side of the road without a home. Like, we should never be optimizing in that degree. It should be like we're solving for everybody needs a home, and then beyond that surplus, yes, we can, benefit from that, and then it also leaves opportunity for there to be transactions. So if an individual wanted to sell their home, there is a viable market to do that, and not just in a sense of like selling it to the people who are coming in and wanting to buy and purchase homes, but also like you want to be able to buy and purchase a home in yourself. So we have to have that kind of like free flow within the market in order for it to be, have that room for new growth and development, and for upgrading, and for, if you're going to grow your family, you're not going to be able to live in the same tiny little starter home that you were in. It was just you and your life partner. Like, you're getting kids, you need more room. And so being able to upgrade in that, and so there has to be room for transaction, for like this free space for people to move into. And free markets are all about creating free space to be able to have that, movability. So transaction can actually happen, and it's not rigid and conformed and constrained, and it's not limiting, and then you don't have people building schemas of exploitation to price people out of, a life vital resource like a home. I very much imagine it kind of like the idea of a pixel frame puzzle, where it's like, it's a picture that is individuated into these little pixels, and it's a puzzle, and there's one free space, and you move the blocks around to be able to get it into its right positioning, that reveals the image that's there. But there's one free space, and that one free space movement is all that you need in order to move all the pieces. You can move all the pieces independently with just having one free space. It's something similar to that, in the sense of like you have to have freedom in the market in order for there to be variability and transaction and efficiency and competitiveness, which goes into the whole capitalism thing. But capitalism's great, but it has to have a proper intended use. Like in the case of housing, like the outcome is to house all people. All people have a safe home space. That's our objective. That's our end goal. That's what we're engineering for. That's the outcome we're trying to achieve. But how we do it is, where you can make, gains within the system of a profit benefit. So we are transacting in a capitalistic way, in a free market, capitalism, but it also has a proper intended use. So it's a proper capitalism in a free market society, and that is the best way to approach our economy. And taking that same innovative approach to solving for it at the higher levels so that we can optimize the efficiencies that bring the effect of affordability down to the consumer level, and then we share collectively, the expense of building out those efficiencies in the systems that help to make the productivity more efficient so we can do more effective, efficient output that makes it a more affordable thing. But again, retaining our quality, doing it in an efficient or fast manner, and also effective, being as most effective as possible to make sure like we're executing this in such a way where we're not building out a bunch of worthless crap that we don't need. We're not investing our resources on stuff that goes to waste. Like, we're doing this in a sense of building up free-flowing abundance that's accessible to all people, but we're spending our resources wisely. So, in a comfortable conservation, right? And with that, I know I just took a big walk down all these different places, but relating into the economic conversation with Scott Bessent today. So, I don't like him as a person. I just really don't, and I don't think that he has the best interests of America at heart. I think he's too aligned with Trump. And he's not thinking clearly in terms of the duties and responsibilities of his role. And so I don't think that he's in service to the American people in such a way that is actually setting us up for failure, unfortunately. I would like to see somebody move into that position with the incoming administration of the next POTUS 48, and for that person to really have a sensibility of, like, they can really sense what proper capitalism is and what it's for and what it's about, and really see it as a mechanization by which we can, like, create efficiencies and optimizations and affordabilities and accessibilities and things like that in such a way where we're creating and generating much economic opportunity. So we're fostering an environment for good economic growth and good and decent work, development of necessary infrastructures and resiliency building and these sorts of things in such a way where we're optimizing our capacity to up-level everyone to the good life. So I'm really hoping for that. That's why it's like, Democrats, I know you're really trying hard to find that language that you can use, to win in the midterms and whatnot. Like, Republicans have lost the point of the exercise a long time ago, and they're going to have to learn some new patterns, relearn some new patterns that actually bring them back into the realm of, like, oh, we're a nation, United States of America. And they're only going to do that once they start breaking away from the MAGA paradigm and the MAGA patterns. But hopefully they find their footing again back on some of the reasonable policies that, Republicans have approached in the past. They're not there yet, and it's going to be a long road, to undo all the programming of MAGification and Trumpism, but, I do believe in them. But the Democratic Party isn't going to win by saying affordability. That means nothing to, a person other than saying, like, affordable. Okay, well, what does that mean? Does it mean that I'm going to be able to afford to go to the store and buy the groceries that I want? Am I going to be able to afford to pay my electricity and not have to, choose between paying my electric bill or buying some food? I'm going to be able to afford my rent. I'm going to be able to afford my car insurance. I'm going to be able to afford my medical insurance. I'm going to be able to afford my medication. Am I going to be able to afford my gas? Am I going to be able to afford, like, creature comforts in my life? I'm going to be able to afford my hygiene kits. Am I going to be able to afford new clothes? I'm going to be able to afford to do my laundry. Am I going to be able to afford to, go out and partake in society, go to a restaurant, these sorts of things? Like, there's lots to affordability. So what does that look like in terms of implementing policy? What sort of project proposals do they have to be able to shake up the economic paradigm to get people on track? And that's where I think they really don't have that vision, and they could really use a vision like mine. And again, like the Republican Party, they need to break away from those MAGA paradigms and Trumpism paradigms and patterns, because they distort reality, first of all. So you can't make appropriate, logical, reasonable decisions about the future because you're operating off of deception and lies. Breaking away from that, like, you can align with, this sensibility of welfaring stewardship as well. It has in the calling to service, lots of jobs, lots of economic opportunities, so much work to be done, all hands on deck. We need everybody involved. So it's not like we won't have, work, and it's not like there aren't going to be things to do. The greatest challenge with this is going to be, okay, we are in a tremendous deficit right now, so far in debt. And the tax code is so stupid. I mean, the whole thing is so stupid. Like, it does not even make sense. It literally is like, a system of exploitation. That needs to be changed. Talked about that a little bit already. Like, and we need to have, like, what are we doing? How are we going to improve? How is this going to improve the lives of every individual? How are we going to get this going in every city, in every town, in every rural area in America? And that's where the, what I call the Eudaimonian framework of a city of cities. And it's a template that we start building out certain types of infrastructures in each one of these cities, towns, and rural areas to level up those areas, build out, small little, like, hub developments that then can be built upon and expanded upon, that helps to level up people in those areas. And as, a certain amount of people are benefited and improved, like, it builds in a, pay it forward kind of way to build out more that helps more people and helps more people. And so there's bringing everybody up, bringing everybody up onto, like, that standard and building our way into that. And there's lots of work to be done for that. So, we'll have everything we need to get to that point, but we're also going to need a lot of people investing themselves and their time to get this good, hard, and necessary work done that's going to go beyond the calling of service in the employment sector, but also being of service to their communities. And so many people are already willing to volunteer. In that sense, I think we should establish a stewardship branch of the military, the non-armed forces part of the military, that can bring people on, bring them online to deploy to do certain projects to help us to advance, to get things done in such a way where it's, pay it forward in service to society for us to level up, and that everybody is participating, everybody's involved, everybody participates and contributes, so that we can get ourselves up to the par where we have the advantages of the surplus of our productivity to make gains in that system that can help us to be able to level up in pay it forward way of investment back into those communities that these people are working from and for, and where they live, so that they can get leveled up. It's a way of, focusing our work and our efforts in those places that are going to help us to be able to optimize for the greatest impact, in, like, the smallest stone, biggest ripple kind of effect, into this pay it forward advantage, and really just putting it on all of us to be a part of that process to level up, because we have to all work together to be able to draw down our exorbitant deficit and get ourselves into a place of surplus, so we have the abundance to be able to start taking risks for higher things. And I've talked about this before, and there's a lot more to it, but that's one of the key ways, along with the adjustments of our tax code, simplification and new orientation and designation of where the tax funds go, and a new orientation of our social welfare systems to create it into a system of, you know, kind of like a holistic benefits package for all Americans, where we get the universal basic health care, and we get the universal sustenance, and I liken it and model it off of military pay. You get a base pay, you get BAS, you get BAH, you get your TRICARE funding, all of these things, and it's for housing, it's for sustenance, it's for healthcare, and it's for your base pay, and combat or hazard pay and these sorts of things. In developing a benefits program that is for all Americans, so we can access, childcare and nutritional sustenance and, housing supports and these sorts of, and healthcare and these sorts of things, because by, making them universal, we can optimize them, and you get kind of like the bulk effect of, when you do more, it costs less for at the individual level, and we optimize for that and create efficiencies for it, and then we can use that to shift away from the old programs, which are like barely hanging on and just are not feasible in the dynamics of the economy as it is now, and they're so dysfunctional we shouldn't be optimizing to prop them up, like Social Security. Brilliant, great idea when it was created, not tenable, not sustainable. We need to reimagine it, rebuild it, bring it into a new sensibility of this holistic, life benefit program, and where all people are involved, that disability, unemployment insurance, Social Security, all of these things into one holistic thing in which everybody benefits based off of what they need, because not everybody has the same needs, but everybody needs something, and we should have a benefits package that helps everybody in the ways that they need help. Scaffolding for their lives so they can live the good life, bring everybody up to that criterion echelon standard of society so everybody's living the good life. And then they have the means to take risks for higher things and build up more generational wealth and accumulate assets and resources and, property and these sorts of things beyond what is just the standard of good life. So there's a lot of work to be done with all of that, but, the economy isn't it's important, but it's not the determining factor of what we do. What we do is creating this, welcoming experience that everybody can thrive on, achieving the preamble promise, the Constitution, the preamble to the Constitution, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty, form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility. How much do we need that one right now? So much. But all of these things together, working in such a way that optimizes and doesn't treat America like it's a business or it's a company, because you're optimizing for the wrong thing. It's not about profits, it's about people. It's about outcomes that make people's lives better. So I see, American government like an innovation, it's a technology. It's this thing that we must, create for. In our way of being in society is this pathological togetherness. It's the art of living together in cities and communities, and really taking all those things into consideration in terms of how we're going to go about working out our American way of life, and to do it in such a way where it's something that we can be proud of, and something we can recognize, and we can, consciously be yes, that's who we are, that's what we're about, that's what we're doing. And that's why having an American identity, embodied with this, archetype of a welfaring stewardship, really is a great way for us to break out of these old paradigms of political toxicity and focus on taking responsibility and ownership for the America that we really want, need, and very much deserve. So With that, I wanted to conclude just to say I very much appreciate Lawrence. The entire MS Now team is, I feel less alone in the world listening to their voices, because every one of them, in their own beautiful, unique, and wonderful ways, very much resonates with who I am as a person, in terms of we have shared in common values, and I'm very grateful for that, and I'm grateful for their voices. And I may not agree with everything that they say, but I still appreciate and respect it, and it definitely helps to inform my perspective with other voices and other world views, which is very, very important, because I know I don't have all the answers, nor do I expect myself to have all the answers, and sometimes it's really good to have somebody to, a soundboard of sorts to reflect on, and being like, I never thought of it that way. Interesting. Just like Lawrence, his segment was disturbing and frustrating, but it was very thought-provoking. Led to me to have this very extremely long video in response to it, so I'm grateful regardless. And with that, I'm grateful for your valued time, attention, and consideration of everything I said. Hopefully it was enlightening, and until next time, I appreciate you. Be well.